The door didn't just close. It slammed, and the sound of it, that heavy, deliberate thud of wood against frame, cut through the howling Wyoming wind like a judgment. Lenora Vance stood on that frozen porch with her 3 boys pressed against her back, the cold eating through their coats, $19 folded inside her glove, and she stared at that closed door for a long moment. She didn't knock again. She had too much dignity left for that. Not much else but that much. Still, her brother-in-law had looked right at her, right at the children, and then he had stepped back and pulled that door shut between them like she was a stranger begging for coins. She wasn't a stranger. She was his dead brother's wife, and those were his dead brother's sons. Most of its windows were dark. If you've ever been turned away by someone who was supposed to be family, if you've ever stood in the cold and realized that the person you counted on had already counted you out, then you already know what Lenora felt on that porch. And if you've never felt it, stay with me. Because what happens next will stay with you. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, if you believe in women who refuse to break even when everything breaks around them, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. We tell stories here that deserve to be heard, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world gave them nothing to work with. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen street in Ash Creek, Wyoming, 1887, and let's meet the cowboy who saw what nobody else bothered to look at. The winter of 1887 came to Wyoming like it had a grudge. It didn't ease in the way winters sometimes do, with a few cold nights that give people time to prepare. It arrived all at once, a wall of temperature that turned the ground iron hard overnight and pushed the sky down to low and gray until you couldn't tell where the land ended. And the clouds began. Old-timers in Ash Creek said it was the worst cold snap in 30 years. They said it with the mild satisfaction of people who have survived things and want some credit for it. Lenora Vance wasn't an old-timer. She'd been in this territory exactly 6 hours. She had come from Cheyenne on the last stage that ran before the weather properly, sitting with her boys, pressed against her on a bench that was never designed for 4 people, watching the landscape outside the frost-edged window become increasingly hostile. Samuel, her oldest at 13, had stopped talking about 50 miles back and taken to watching the horizon with an expression that was too old for his face. 8-year-old Eli had fallen asleep against her arm, with the particular boneless exhaustion of a child who had been brave for too long. And little Thomas, 5 years old, gap-toothed, with hair that no comb could fully negotiate, had asked her 14 times over 2 days if they were almost there. She had told him yes each time, which was the one lie she'd permitted herself. The truth was, she didn't know what this was going to look like. She'd been telling herself a story for 3 weeks since the day she'd buried Daniel and found the letter in his coat pocket, the one he'd written 6 months before he died, as if he'd suspected something was coming but hadn't wanted to alarm her. If anything happens to me, the letter said, go to Nolan. He's difficult, but he'll do right by you. He's family. He knows what that means. Daniel had believed that about his brother, with the particular loyalty of a man who chooses to see the best in people he loves. Lenora had held on to that letter through the funeral and the sale of their house and the wagon ride to the stage depot. She had held on to it the way you hold on to something when you have nothing else to hold on to, not because you're certain it will save you, but because letting go means admitting there is nothing. She found out what Nolan Vance thought family meant at 30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in front of his own front door. His house was not difficult to locate. Ash Creek was not a large town, 2 streets of proper buildings, a scatter of homes beyond that, and the kind of general quietness that settles over places where people have learned to stay indoors when the weather is serious. The stage driver had pointed her toward the north end of town and said Nolan Vance ran a dry goods operation and everybody knew him. He'd set in the way people say things about someone that contains more than the words actually carry, and Lenora had been too cold and too tired to read it properly at the time. She should have read it. She walked those 2 streets with her boys, arranged behind her Samuel at the back, with their single heavy trunk, because he was 13, and therefore the one she could ask things like that of, without the request breaking her heart. And she went up the front steps of Nolan Vance's house, and she knocked. He opened the door himself. He was Daniel's older brother by 8 years, and he looked it heavier in the jaw, harder in the eyes, with the kind of face that had once been similar to Daniel's and had since taken a different direction. He looked at Lenora for a moment. Then he looked past her at the 3 children on the steps. Then he looked back at her. Lenora, not a greeting. Just identification, Nolan. She kept her voice steady. She had practiced this. We've had a difficult journey. The boys are cold. I was hoping we could come inside. I got your letter. She waited. I told Daniel years ago that I couldn't take on obligations, Nolan said. His voice was flat. He wasn't yelling. That was almost the worst part of it. He was perfectly calm, like this was a business matter he'd already thought through and concluded. I've got my own family, my own expenses. Whatever Daniel promised you, that was Daniel. That wasn't me. He didn't promise me anything, Lenora said carefully. He said you would help. He said a lot of things. Nolan's jaw shifted. Daniel was always saying things. Didn't always think them through. Behind her, she heard Samuel go very still. She didn't turn around. If she turned around right now, she was going to see her oldest boy's face doing something she was not ready to watch. It's below freezing, she said. My children, I'm sorry for your situation. He said it like a sentence he'd rehearsed. Truly am. But I can't help you. There's a boarding house on the south end. Mrs. Caldwell. She takes people on sometimes when they're in need. And then he stepped back. Just one step. Just enough to be clearly inside rather than at the threshold. And he closed the door. Not violently. Not with anger. With something much worse than anger. With finality. Lenora stood on that porch, and she did not move for a full 30 seconds. She was counting them. Something she did when she needed to hold herself together. She counted, kept her breathing even. Let the number give her mind something small and manageable to do, while the larger thing settled. At 30, she turned around. Samuel was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror the morning after Daniel died. It was the expression of someone who has just absorbed a blow and is deciding in real time whether to fall. Well, she said, and then she didn't say anything else for a moment, because she hadn't figured out what came after well yet. Mrs. Caldwell, Samuel said quietly. That's right. She straightened her coat. Let's go find Mrs. Caldwell. What she did not say was that she had $6.40 in her glove. The remaining $12.60 were inside the lining of the trunk, sewn in by her own hand the night before they left Cheyenne, because she'd read enough about frontier travel to know that what you could reach was what could be taken. She had $19 total, 3 children, no local connections, no employment, and a blizzard that 3 different people on the stage had mentioned was going to be bad. She had known in some part of herself she'd been refusing to listen to that Nolan might not come through. She had known it the way you know things you don't want to know carefully, from a distance, not quite looking directly at the possibility. But there is a difference between suspecting a door might be closed and standing on the other side of it after it's shut. Cold hit her differently as she came back down the steps. More real, somehow. More personal. The main street of Ash Creek was not bustling. The weather had driven most people indoors, but it wasn't completely empty either. A man was loading something into a wagon on the far side, moving with the efficient purposefulness of someone who wants to finish before the wind gets worse. A woman hurried past with her head down. A dog stood in the middle of the street, looking unsure about its life choices. Lenora oriented herself toward the south end of town. She estimated it was maybe a quarter mile. She could see the shape of it from here, the buildings thinning out the last few structures before the open land began. My feet are cold, Thomas announced. I know, baby. She took his hand. Are we almost there? She almost said again, stopped herself. We're walking, she said instead. That's all we're doing right now. Just walking. They were about 100 yards down the street when she noticed the man with the wagon had stopped loading. He was looking at them. Not rudely, not the way some men look at a woman alone, measuring and calculating. He was just watching, with the careful attention of someone who is trying to understand something. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall enough that even at this distance, the proportions were clear. Long legs, wide shoulders, the kind of build that comes from 30 years of physical work rather than 30 years of deciding to look that way. His coat was heavy wool, worn through at the elbows. His hat was pulled down against the wind. His face, what she could see of it, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 lines around the eyes, a jaw that had some graying along the edge. He was still watching. Lenora looked away and kept walking. She had enough problems without a strange man's attention, but something made her look back once, and when she did, he had crossed the street. He was walking toward them now, not rushing, not aggressive, just walking with that ground-eating stride of a man who goes where he intends to go. She stopped, put herself slightly in front of Thomas without thinking about it. He stopped about 6 feet away and took off his hat. That surprised her. Not many men bothered with hat manners in the middle of a blizzard. "Ma'am." His voice was low and unhurried. "I couldn't help but notice you just came from the Vance place." "That's right." She kept her voice neutral. "Nolan turn you away?" She looked at him carefully. "I don't know that that's your business." "No," he said. "It isn't." He didn't apologize for the question, which she found she respected slightly more than if he had. "My name's Garrick Holt. I run Iron Hollow Ranch about 4 miles east." He glanced at the boys, not appraising, just noting, "Your littlest one doesn't have adequate boots for what's coming tonight." Lenora looked down at Thomas's feet. She knew it. She'd known it since Cheyenne and had been trying not to think about it, because there was nothing she could do about it. "We're looking for Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house," she said. Garrick Holt was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not pity exactly. More like recognition of a specific kind of arithmetic. "Mrs. Caldwell closed up 2 weeks ago," he said. "Her daughter in Denver took ill. She's gone till spring, maybe longer." The wind pushed between them. Lenora felt it in her back teeth. "Is there another boarding house?" Samuel asked from behind her. His voice was carefully controlled the way it got when he was frightened and trying not to show it. Lenora had been hearing that voice for 3 weeks, and it never failed to do something uncomfortable to her chest. "Not in Ash Creek," Garrick said. He said it simply, without adding anything, like he understood that elaborating would make it worse. He was looking at Lenora. "I've got a foreman's cabin on the ranch that's been sitting empty since August. It's got a wood stove that works, and there's wood already stacked." Lenora said nothing. "I'm not talking about charity," he said, and his voice shifted slightly more deliberate, like he'd said something similar before and learned to be precise about it. "I'm talking about shelter in exchange for work. I've got ranch families whose children haven't had regular schooling in 2 years. If you can teach, there's a fair arrangement to be made." "You don't know if I can teach." "You carry yourself like someone who reads," he said. "That's more than we've got currently." It was possibly the strangest compliment she had ever received. She looked at him for a long moment. She had been lied to before. She had been offered things that came with conditions printed in smaller letters than the offer. She had learned in 4 years of frontier marriage and 3 weeks of frontier widowhood to look at people's eyes when they said things rather than just their mouths. His eyes were dark and steady, and they did not move away from hers. "How do I know what I'm walking into?" she said. "You don't," he said. "But you're standing in the middle of a street in Wyoming in January with those boots on that boy, and in about 2 hours that storm is going to be something other than inconvenient." He put his hat back on. "I'll go hitch the wagon. You can decide what you decide." He walked back across the street. He didn't look over his shoulder. Lenora watched him go. Then she looked at Samuel, who was watching her with that expression, the one swatchin again, the one that was too old for his face, the one that asked a question without asking it. "What do you think?" she said. She asked him that sometimes. It wasn't weakness. He'd earned the right to have opinions. Samuel looked at the man across the street, then down at Thomas's boots. "I think Thomas's feet are really cold," he said. Eli, who had been quiet through much of this, pulled on Lenora's coat. "Cowboy nice?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "He has a big horse," Eli said, as if this were relevant data. Lenora exhaled. There was something almost like a laugh in it, though it came out sideways. She looked at the closed door of Nolan Vance's house one more time. She looked at her boys. She looked at the wagon being hitched across the street by a man whose last name she had learned 3 minutes ago. And she made the only decision available to someone who has stopped having the luxury of better options. "Come on," she said. "Stay close." The 4 of them crossed the street. She didn't know then, couldn't have known, that crossing that particular street on that particular evening was going to be the decision that changed everything. Not just for her children, not just for Iron Hollow Ranch, but for an entire frontier community that didn't yet realize how badly it needed what she was about to accidentally build. She just knew that the man with the wagon hadn't looked away from her eyes when he made his offer. And she knew her youngest son's feet were turning blue. Emo this debate, and she knew that $19 in a dead man's letter were not enough to survive what was coming through that sky. Garrick Holt was loading the last of his supplies when she came up beside the wagon. He looked at her just a glance, no triumph in it, no satisfaction. Like he was simply noting that she was there. Mrs. Vance, he said. There will be rules, she said. Clear ones. In writing, if possible. That's fair. My boys are not to be given orders by anyone except me. Also fair. And if this arrangement stops working, she said, I need to know there's a way out that doesn't leave us worse off than we are right now. He seemed to think about that for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking. If it stops working, he said, I'll give you 30 days' notice and enough supplies to reach the next town. That's what I give anyone who works at Iron Hollow when things don't work out. You've given that deal before? Twice, he said. Both times they stayed. She looked at him. That's not exactly a reassuring statistic. No, he agreed, but it's an honest one. Thomas had attached himself to Lenora's side and was staring up at Garrick with the frank evaluation only very small children can achieve without embarrassment. Are you a real cowboy? He asked. Garrick looked down at him. More or less. Do you have cows? A few hundred. Thomas considered this. My papa is dead, he said, in the same conversational tone a child might announce they'd eaten oatmeal for breakfast. Something moved through Garrick Holt's face. Not discomfort, not the flustered awkwardness most adults displayed when confronted with a small child's unfiltered grief. Something quieter and more honest than that. I know, he said. I'm sorry about your papa. Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and climbed toward the wagon. Lenora watched that exchange and filed it away. She filed it in the same place. She filed all the small true things she noticed about Pipple, the place that was separate from hope or expectation, just observation, just evidence to be weighed later. She helped Eli up, then Thomas. Samuels swung up on his own. She took Garrick Holt's offered hand to step up, noted that his grip was firm, and let go the instant she was settled, and arranged herself on the bench. The wagon rolled east. Behind them, Ash Creek disappeared into the gray. The wind came fully alive as the last building fell away, unobstructed now by anything except distance. Most of its windows dark, Lenora pulled Thomas against her and watched the dark line of mountains ahead, and tried very hard not to think about everything that could still go wrong. She was very good at not thinking about things. She had been practicing for years. What she could not have predicted, what nobody in that wagon could have predicted, was that by the time this story was over, she wouldn't need that skill anymore. Because the things worth surviving were coming, and so, in their own time, were the things worth building. But that was still a long road ahead. Right now there was just the cold and the wind, and a stranger's wagon rolling east through the last light, carrying 4 people towards something none of them could yet name. Cabin was not what she expected. She hadn't let herself expect much that was a habit she'd developed somewhere in the last 3 weeks. The careful management of expectation down to nearly nothing, because nothing couldn't disappoint you. But she had braced herself for something barely habitable. Something that would require her to pretend, for the children's sake, that it was fine. It was not fine, exactly, but it was real. The foreman's cabin sat about 200 yards from the main ranch house, close enough to the barn that you could smell horses through the walls when the wind was right. It was a single room with a sleeping loft, which meant the boys would take the loft, and she would sleep near the stove, which was already her plan before anyone suggested it. The wood stove in the corner was cold but structurally intact, with a good slit obvious beside it that someone had placed there with obvious purpose. The walls had been chinked properly. The floor was bare but solid. There was a table with 3 chairs, and a 4th chair that didn't quite match, and a shelf on the east wall that held nothing but dust, and 1 abandoned coffee cup. A ranch hand named Floyd, who was approximately 60 years old, said nothing unnecessary, and moved with the specific economy of a man who had done hard work so long that waste had been eliminated entirely from his body, had driven ahead of Garrick's wagon to start the fire. By the time they arrived, the stove had been going long enough to take the worst edge off the cold. It'll be warm in an hour, Garrick said from the doorway. He hadn't come inside. He was standing on the threshold with his hat in his hand, and Lenora noticed he had not entered without being asked. That too went into the file. "Thank you," she said. "Floyd'll bring supper from the main house. Just stew tonight. Cook doesn't do much else when it's this cold." He paused. "If you need more blankets, there's a chest in the barn loft. Floyd knows where." Thomas had already climbed onto one of the chairs and was inspecting the coffee cup with the intensity of a scholar examining a primary source. Eli was standing near the wood stove with his palms out, soaking in heat like a plant that had been away from sunlight too long. Samuels had set down the trunk and was quietly taking stock of the room corners, door, window, the way he did every new space now. Lenora watched him do it and did not say anything. Some habits were reasonable even when they were sad. "Mr. Holt," she said. He looked at her, "the arrangement we discussed. I'd like to put it down in writing tomorrow. Not because I distrust you." She paused, choosing words with the precision of someone who had learned that imprecision costs you. "But because I have 3 sons and no husband, and written agreements are the only kind that hold up when circumstances change." He nodded. "Tomorrow morning, after breakfast. And I'll need to see where the school would be, whatever space you have in mind. There's a supply building we're not using on the east side of the property. It needs work, but the roof is sound. I'll want to see it before I agree to use it." "Fair enough." He put his hat back on. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Vance." He left. The door closed behind him gently, which she noted. She stood in the center of that small cabin, with her 3 boys arranged around her in various stages of exhaustion, and she breathed in the smell of wood smoke and old timber and horse, and she allowed herself approximately 45 seconds of something that wasn't quite relief, because relief required having felt safe first, and she hadn't felt safe in a long time, but was adjacent to it, a loosening of something that had been very tightly wound. Then Thomas asked if there was cornbread with the stew, and she said she didn't know, and he said he hoped so, and Eli said he didn't even like cornbread, and Samuel told Eli that was a stupid thing to care about right now. And Eli said, "You're stupid," and Lenora said both of their names in the voice that stopped arguments, and the cabin filled up with the ordinary noise of being a family. She was grateful for the noise. The noise meant they were still here. Floyd arrived with the stew 20 minutes later. No cornbread, which Thomas accepted with more grace than Lenora expected. Stew was heavy and oversalted and slightly too thick, and the best thing she had eaten in 6 days. She got the boys into the loft, with 2 blankets and 1 complaint from Eli about the ladder being steep, listened until the arguing above her head gave way to the slow rhythm of 3 children sleeping, and then sat down at the table alone for the first time all day. She had $19 and a roof. It was not much. But 24 hours ago, she had had $19 and a blizzard. So, by that measure, the situation had technically improved. She didn't sleep well. The wood stove popped and settled. The wind worked at the corners of the cabin. She lay on the narrow cot she'd found, folded against one wall, and stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the storm do what storms do, and she thought about Daniel. Not the grief of him, she'd done most of that crying already. In private, in the 40 minutes she'd allowed herself each night, after the boys were asleep. She thought about what he would have made of this. He'd been a man who trusted people more readily than evidence, sometimes warranted. He'd trusted Nolan, and that had been wrong. He'd trusted the mining company that employed him, and that had been wrong too, in its own different way. But he'd also trusted her, and whatever else Daniel Vance had gotten wrong, his trust in Lenora had never been misplaced. She made herself a silent, unarticulated promise in the dark of that cabin, the kind that doesn't need words because it's made at a level below language. She was not going to let what Nolan had done define the next chapter. She was not going to become someone who'd been turned away. She was going to become someone who'd gone somewhere better. Morning arrived gray and brutal, the blizzard having deposited 1.5 feet of snow across the ranch. Lenora was up before the boys, dressed and presentable by the time she heard the first sounds from the loft, which meant she was up before 5, because Samuel was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 5:15, regardless of circumstances. The main house was warm, and its kitchen was operated by a woman named Ida Marsh, who was 53 years old, built like a person who had never had any use for nonsense, and who set a plate of biscuits in front of Lenora without being asked and said, "Coffee's hot." Kids eat in 20 minutes. Thank you, Lenora said. Ida looked at her with the assessing directness of someone who does not waste time on social performance. You a real teacher or the kind who just knows how to read? I taught school in Laramie for 4 years before I married, Lenora said. Mathematics through algebra, reading, composition, some history. Ida nodded slowly, as if updating a calculation. The Brennan kids haven't had proper schooling in 3 years. The Olstitz boy reads fine, but the middle one thinks numbers are suggestions. That's correctable, Lenora said. The Yates girls is 12 but reads at 8-year-old level because nobody's pushed her. Also correctable. Ida looked at her for another moment. You'll do, she said, and turned back to the stove. Lenora hid a small smile in her coffee cup. The written agreement with Garrick happened at 9 in the morning, at the table in the main house, with both of them seated across from each other and Ida loudly ignoring everything from the kitchen. He had already written out the basic terms in a hand that was surprisingly legible use of the foreman's cabin at no charge, a monthly wage for teaching equivalent to what the county paid teachers in Laramie, access to the ranch's food stores for herself and her children, 30 days' notice on either side if the arrangement ended. He had also written in, without her prompting, that her boys were to be treated as welcome members of the Iron Hollow community and not as charity cases, and that any person on the ranch who treated them otherwise would answer to him directly. She read it twice, found nothing she needed to argue with. That itself made her more suspicious than less. She had learned that things which seemed entirely reasonable often contained the difficult part in what they didn't say. What do you get out of this? She said. He looked up from the paper. Teachers, he said. Told you. 8 children's schooling doesn't require this level of arrangement. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Iron Hollow isn't just my ranch, Mrs. Vance. I've got 4 families working this land who've got nowhere else to go if they leave here. People the town doesn't exactly welcome. I've been trying to build something that lasts, and lasting things need children who can read and figure numbers. He paused. Also, Floyd's wife has been after me for 2 years to find someone to teach, because she says I can't do it myself, and she's right. That was a more honest answer than she'd expected. She signed the paper. The supply building he showed her that afternoon was not a school. It was 4 walls and a leaking section of floor, and a broken window that had been covered with oilskins that was itself beginning to fail. It was full of old rope and broken tools, and something that had once been a feed bag, and was now more of an idea. You said the roof was sound, she said it is. She looked up at the roof, then back at him. Everything below the roof needs work. I've got men who can fix the floor and the window. I'll need a proper door that closes fully, and light more than 1 window. Children can't read in bad light. 2 windows, he said. 3 south-facing, if possible. He looked at the south wall. 2 south and 1 east. That works. She walked the length of the room, stepping over the rope and what she was now identifying as a broken axle. I'll need shelves. A board across sawhorses will do for desks to start, but proper desks within 6 months. You're negotiating the interior of a building you agreed 5 minutes ago to use. Yes, she said. Is that a problem? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not irritation. Something closer to the way a person looks when they've made a bet and are reconsidering whether they'd estimated correctly. No, he said. 2 south windows, 1 east, shelves. Floyd'll have the floor patched by the end of the week, and the rope needs to go. The rope will go. She nodded. Looked at the space again, trying to see it without what was in it, trying to see what it could be instead of what it was. So she was good at that. She'd been doing it with her own life for the better part of a month. 8 children, she said. Ages? 5 through 14. Some overlap in levels. I can work with that. She turned toward the door. I'll start assessments Monday, if the floor is done. It'll be done, he said. She almost said we'll see the habit of mild skepticism ran deep, but she stopped herself. She said, good instead, and went back to her children. The first 2 weeks at Iron Hollow were not graceful. Lenora had not expected grace. Grace was for people who didn't have 3 sons, and a room to furnish with nothing, and a school to build from salvaged lumber. What she had expected was difficulty, and difficulty is what arrived, promptly and in quantity. Thomas got into a fight with Eddie Brennan, 9 years old, opinions about everything on day 4, over the use of a sled that apparently both of them felt entitled to. It ended with Thomas in tears and Eddie with a bite mark on his arm, and Lenora having a very uncomfortable conversation with Eddie's mother, Ruth Brennan, who was understandably unimpressed. Lenora made Thomas apologize. Thomas apologized badly. She made him apologize again. The second one was marginally better. Ruth Brennan remained unimpressed, but shifted from actively hostile to cautiously watchful, which was something. Eli got sick on day 9. The cold he'd been holding off the whole journey finally arrived, full and emphatic. And he spent 3 days in the loft with a fever that had Lenora up every few hours checking his breathing. Ida Marsh appeared on the second day with something in a jar that smelled like a laboratory accident and claimed it would break the fever by morning. Lenora was skeptical. The fever broke by morning. She chose not to examine this too closely. Samuel Full, her quiet one, her oldest soul child, was the one she worried about in a different way. He'd taken to helping Floyd with the livestock, which was fine, which was good even, except that she noticed he was up before dawn to do it and didn't mention it to her. And when she asked Floyd about it, Floyd said Samuel had just showed up one morning and started working and hadn't stopped. She asked Samuel about it. "I should be earning something," Samuel said. He was 13. He said it like a man who had already accepted a conclusion. "That is not your job right now," she said. "You're doing all of it," he said. "You're doing everything. That's my job right now. Yours is school." He looked away. She could see him deciding not to say the thing he was thinking, which she suspected was something about how school didn't put food on the table, and she respected the decision, even as she understood exactly where the thought came from. He'd watched her sell their furniture to pay debts and eat half portions without comment for 2 months. He'd absorbed lessons she'd never intended to teach. "You can work with Floyd on Saturday mornings," she said, after a moment. "1 morning a week, if he'll have you." Samuel looked back at her. Something shifted in his face. "Yeah? On the condition that you tell me. You don't just appear somewhere before sunrise without telling me where you are." "I can't," she stopped. Started again. "I need to know where my boys are. That's not negotiable." "Okay," he said, quietly. And then a beat later, "Sorry, Mom." She nodded, put a hand on his shoulder briefly. "Floyd's going to work you hard." "I know." There was something that was almost a smile. "He already told me I hold a shovel wrong." "You probably do." He did smile then, just a small one. But she counted it. The school opened on the second Monday. Floor newly patched, 2 south windows installed, the broken glass replaced. She had 9 students in the end, 8 ranch children, plus Thomas, who she included partly because he needed structure, and partly because having him in the room with her was preferable to wondering what he was destroying unsupervised. She had made a bench from a board and 2 sawhorses and covered it with a piece of fabric from her own trunk. And it looked like exactly what it was, a makeshift solution in a repurposed building, and she decided she didn't care. The first morning she assessed all 9 children in reading and arithmetic. What she found was roughly what she'd expected, a wide spectrum. Some children sharper than their apparent level, and some struggling more than they'd been told. The Yates girl Clara, 12, quiet to the point of near invisibility, read haltingly at first, and then, when Lenora handed her a different book, a novel rather than a primer, suddenly smoothly, and with comprehension that made Lenora stop and reassess entirely. "How long have you been able to read like that?" Lenora asked her, after the other children were occupied with arithmetic problems. Clara looked at the book. "Just regular books, I guess." "Has anyone given you regular books before?" Clara shook her head. Lenora made a note. Clara Yates was not a struggling reader. Clara Yates had been chronically underchallenged, which is an entirely different problem and in some ways a worse one because it masquerades as limitation when it is actually waste. The Brennan middle boy Henry, 10, the one Ida had warned her about, did in fact treat numbers as suggestions. He also had a tendency to talk while Lenora was talking, which she addressed on the first day by assigning him the job of writing the arithmetic problems on the board, which required him to understand them first. This worked better than she'd hoped, largely because Henry turned out to be a child who responded to responsibility, the way some children respond to punishment with visible, almost surprised improvement. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She'd forgotten that, somewhere in the last few terrible months. You forget what you're good at when everything else is falling apart. But it was coming back. It was in the 3rd week that she first encountered Amos Pike, And she encountered him the way you encounter a weather change gradually, and then all at once. She had gone into Ash Creek with Garrick to collect supplies, because one of the things the written agreement had not specified was how she was to get to town when needed, and Garrick had simply said he'd take her when he went, which was once a week on Thursdays. She had her list, and he had his, and they drove in together in a comfortable enough silence that had developed between them over 3 weeks, not the silence of the people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have learned. They don't need to fill space to be in the same space. She had noticed, somewhere in those 3 weeks, that he was a careful man. He said fewer words than the situation required, but the words he chose were accurate. He did not make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He did not ask her questions she hadn't invited. He had appeared at the cabin door once, when the window latch needed repair, once to inform her that there was a foaling happening in the barn that Thomas had asked about, watching, and both times he'd knocked, waited, and stepped back when she opened the door. She had also noticed that his ranch workers spoke to him differently than she'd seen workers speak to ranch owners before, without deference, exactly, more like colleagues. Like people who had agreed on something and were carrying it out together. She'd asked Ida about it one morning. Ida had given her a look. "You know why half these people are here," she said. "Martinez's family husband lost 2 fingers in a sawmill accident. Nobody else would hire him. Brennan's Ruth's first husband was a drunk who left her with 3 kids and a debt. Garrick paid off the debt. Don't ask me why. Yates's, that's a story I won't tell without permission." She turned back to the stove. Garrick doesn't collect strays. He collects people who got handed a bad situation and need a level place to stand. "What happened to his wife?" Lenora asked. She'd been careful not to ask before, but 3 weeks felt like enough time. Ida was quiet for a moment. "Fever," she said. 15 years back. He was away, expanding the ranch. She was 7 months gone with their first, a pause. He got back 3 days after. Lenora said nothing. "Some things don't require a response." "He built this place after," Ida said. "Spent about 2 years where nobody was sure he was going to come back from whatever was in his head. Then he started hiring people other ranchers wouldn't take. And he kept going." She glanced over her shoulder at Lenora. "He's not a saint about it. He's difficult when he's tired, and he's stubborn about things that don't matter. And sometimes he makes decisions without explaining them, which drives Floyd absolutely to madness." The corner of her mouth moved. "But he does what he says he'll do." Lenora thought about that on the drive into Ash Creek. She thought about what it cost to build something for other people after losing the one thing you built everything else for. She understood the impulse maybe too. She was still thinking about it when she saw the man watching them from the doorway of the hardware store. He was perhaps 55, broad through the shoulders, with a carefully trimmed beard and the kind of clothes that announced wealth without shouting about it. He watched the wagon with an expression that she might have described as territorial, the look of a man who has decided that something belongs in his field of vision and is unhappy to find otherwise. She didn't ask who he was on the ride back, but she remembered the look. She found out his name 4 days later when Ruth Brennan came to the cabin door, with an expression she hadn't had on her face before, the expression of someone who has been given information they don't quite know what to do with. "I need to tell you something," Ruth said, "and I want you to know I don't believe it. I want to say that first." Lenora opened the door wider. "Come in." Ruth came in, did not sit. She was the kind of woman who delivered bad news standing, which Lenora could respect. "Amos Pike told my husband that you came to this ranch under false pretenses," Ruth said. "That you'd pursued Garrick and Cheyenne before your husband even died. That you came here specifically because you knew about Iron Hollow and wanted to get your hands on it somehow." She said the last part with visible embarrassment, like the sentence tasted bad. Lenora was quiet for a moment. The wood stove settled. From the loft, she could hear Thomas moving around, doing whatever 5-year-olds do when left unsupervised, with a collection of sticks they'd found interesting. "Who is Amos Pike?" she said. "He owns the feed company that supplies most of the ranches in this valley," Ruth said. "He's on the town council. He owns the banknote on about 1/3 of the properties in Ash Creek." A pause. "He and Garrick have never gotten along. Something before my time, I don't know the details. And he's saying I'm here because I deceived Garrick. He's saying yes. I came here because a man named Nolan Vance closed a door in my face. In a blizzard, Lenora said. Her voice was even. I had never heard of Garrick Holt before that evening. I had never heard of Iron Hollow Ranch. She looked at Ruth directly. I came here because your employer offered my children shelter when no one else did. That is the entirety of the story. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring, she seemed to come to a conclusion. I know, she said. Like I said, I don't believe it. She paused. But Amos Pike believes a lot of people in this town. And they listen. Why does he want to damage Garrick? Ruth started to say something. Stopped. Then said Garrick doesn't need him. He's built something here that the town uses his people by. In town, his workers spend money in town, but he doesn't owe Pike anything, and Pike can't stand that. She smoothed the front of her coat in the way people do when they've said more than they planned. I thought you should know. After Ruth left, Lenora sat at the table for a while. She had known something like this was coming. Not the specifics, but something. Because she was a woman alone on a prosperous man's property, and she had been around enough people to know that the world reliably finds the worst interpretation of a situation involving a woman alone on a prosperous man's property. She had two choices. She could stay and be the story people told about her, or she could stay and build something true enough to make the story irrelevant. She pulled out her lesson plan for the following week and kept working. She had Clara Yates reading advanced material by the end of the first month. She had Henry Brennan performing accurate arithmetic so long as he was given the chalk and the responsibility of the board. She had a shy, round-faced boy named Peter Martinez who had told her on the first day that he was bad at letters, but who, she discovered, had the kind of visual intelligence that meant he could look at a page of text and understand the structure before he could read the words, which is a gift dressed as a problem if nobody teaches you how to use it. She started giving Peter diagrams alongside his reading passages. His comprehension jumped. She was proud of this. She was allowed to be proud of it. She had 4 ranch women sit in on a lesson one Friday afternoon, just to observe, 3 of them with small children on their laps. She had Ruth Brennan bring her youngest so he could hear letter sounds. She had Ida Marsh, who claimed she was only there to return a borrowed pot, sit in the back and say nothing for 45 minutes. And then, on the way out, quietly ask if she might borrow the arithmetic primer over the weekend because she'd always been shaky on long division, and it had bothered her for 30 years. Take it as long as you need, Lenora said. Ida looked at the primer, then at Lenora. You're doing good work, she said, with the tone of someone making a factual statement rather than a compliment. Thank you. Don't get too comfortable, Ida said, but she said it with something in her eyes that softened the edge. That's not a threat, just frontier wisdom. And she took the primer and left. The rumors from Pike did not stop. They shifted, evolved. By the beginning of the second month, they had acquired details they hadn't started. The story now included a claim that Lenora had engineered the confrontation with Nolan Vance, had somehow arranged to be seen in distress at exactly the right moment to attract Garrick's attention. There was a version making rounds that suggested she'd had correspondence with Garrick before arriving. There was another version that she'd come to Iron Hollow before, years ago, which was false in a way so complete, it almost circled back to being interesting. She heard these stories through Ruth, through Ida, and once, accidentally, through a partial overheard conversation between 2 merchants when she was in Ash Creek for supplies. She did not respond to any of them publicly. She did not go looking for Pike to confront him. She went home and taught school. What she didn't expect was for Garrick to hear the same stories and come to her cabin that evening and stand in the doorway looking, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely unsettled. You've heard what Pike is saying, he said. It wasn't a question. For about 3 weeks now. He looked at her. The unsettled thing moved across his face again. Why didn't you tell me? What would you have done? She said. He didn't have an answer to that, immediately, which told her he'd been asking himself the same question. This isn't your problem to carry alone, he said finally. I didn't carry it alone, she said. I just didn't hand it to you. He absorbed that. She could see him working with it, deciding if the distinction mattered. Families are being told to pull their children from school, he said. Pike's talked to 2 of the merchants about pulling their business from us. I know, Lenora. He used her name, which he almost never did. If you want to take this fight on, I'll stand beside you. But if you'd rather leave before it gets worse, I'm not leaving, she said. He waited. I am not leaving, she said again, clearer. I have 9 children who have made measurable academic progress in 6 weeks. Clara Yates is reading novels. Henry Brennan just correctly completed his first long division problem and looked like someone had handed him a coin. She met his eyes. I am not leaving because Amos Pike has decided I am inconvenient. Garrick looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves the way it always did. Iron Hollow was the kind of place where the wind never fully stopped, just shifted in direction and intensity. All right, he said. All right? That's it. Just all right. He seemed like he was going to say something else and then decided against it. He put his hat back on. I'll talk to the families myself tomorrow. Garrick. He paused at the door. Whatever history you have with Pike, she said, I'm not going to become a casualty of it. I want to be clear about that. You're not, he said. That's not what this is. Then make sure what this is stays cleaner than what he's claiming it is. There was a silence between them. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like charged. Like something that had been building pressure had decided to acknowledge itself. I hear you, he said. He left. She stood in the middle of her cabin. Her cabin now, she had started thinking of it that way without noticing when the shift had happened, and she breathed out slowly. The wood stove was warm. From the loft she could hear Eli and Thomas arguing quietly about something involving a carved wooden horse that Samuel had made for Thomas and that Eli had temporarily borrowed. Samuel was telling them both to be quiet in the weary voice of a 13-year-old who has become the de facto authority figure of a loft. She had built this, she thought. Not alone. Not from nothing. But she had built it from $19 and a closed door and the decision to cross a frozen street, and what she had built was real enough that a man with money and influence felt the need to lie about it. That meant it was real enough to defend. She went to her trunk and pulled out the school's attendance ledger and began updating it for the week, because there was always something to do, and she had found that keeping her hands busy was the most reliable cure for the particular kind of anxiety that arrived at night. Outside, Iron Hollow settled into the sound it always made after dark horses shifting, wood contracting in the cold, the far-off low of cattle in the north pasture. A sound that had become familiar enough to be comforting. She kept writing. The thing about rumors is that they don't need to be believed to do damage. Lenora understood this better than she wanted to. She had watched it happen in Laramie once, years before, when a woman in her neighborhood had been which was whispered about nothing specific, nothing provable, just the sustained pressure of implication. And within 6 months, the woman had packed her children and left for Denver without anyone ever having said a single thing to her face that could be called an accusation. The town hadn't driven her out. The town had simply made the air. She breathed thin enough that staying became harder than going. Pike was doing the same thing to Iron Hollow, and he was good at it. The first family pulled their children from the school on a Wednesday morning in early March, 3 months after Lenora had arrived. It was the Caldwell family, not Mrs. Caldwell of the boarding house, a different Caldwell, a farming family that lived at the edge of the valley and whose 2 children had been among Lenora's quieter students. The father came himself, which she respected even as she resented what he came to say. He was a thin man with the look of someone permanently caught between 2 opinions, and he stood in the doorway of the schoolroom and told her that he meant respect and that he'd heard she was a fine teacher, but that circumstances had changed. What circumstances? She asked, though she already knew. He looked at his boots. There's talk, he said, about this place, about arrangements. About me, you mean? He didn't answer that directly. My wife is concerned about the Children's Association with. He stopped, started again. We've got business in town. People we deal with. People who deal with Pike. She heard it clearly enough without him saying it. Your children were doing well, she said. Your youngest was 2 weeks from reading her first full chapter book. The man's jaw tightened. She could see he wasn't entirely comfortable with what he was doing. That was something, she supposed, though not much. Discomfort had never stopped a man from doing the convenient thing. I'm sorry, he said, and closed the door. She stood in the empty space he'd left, and she allowed herself exactly 1 minute of something that felt like defeat. She counted it precisely because she'd learned that if you don't give it a minute, it finds more time later. Most of its windows were dark. Then she turned back to 7 students still seated at their boards, all of whom had heard every word and were watching her with the careful attention children apply to adults. In moments of adult difficulty, trying to calibrate whether alarm is appropriate. Arithmetic, she said. Henry, bring me the long division problems from last Thursday. We're going to try the double-digit divisors today. Henry Brennan looked at her for a moment. He was 10, and he had the emotional perceptions that certain children develop early, the kind that comes from growing up in a household that required it. He looked at her like he understood what had just happened and was deciding what to do with that understanding. Then he got up and went for the problems. She taught the rest of that morning like nothing had changed. Because if she taught like something had changed, it would change more. Garrick heard about the Caldwell children that evening. She hadn't told him she'd told no one, just recorded the attendance with the names absent, but Iron Hollow was 4 miles from town, and news traveled fast when Pike was distributing it. He came to the cabin after supper, which was later than he usually appeared, and she could tell from the quality of his stillness when she opened the door that he was holding something in check. You knew they were pulling the kids, he said. It happened this morning. You didn't send word. I handled the morning, she said. There was nothing to send word about. He looked at her. Most of its windows were dark. She had come to know his silences well enough by now to distinguish them the silence of a man thinking, the silence of a man who had already thought and was waiting for the right moment to speak, and the silence of a man who was frustrated but was choosing not to express it in ways he'd regret. This was the third kind. There are 2 more families Pike has talked to, he said. The Harpers and the Suggs. He's telling them that if their children continue attending the school, he'll look less favorably on their loan applications when they come due in the fall. The stove popped. From the loft, she could hear Thomas's small night sounds. The boy made sounds in his sleep, little murmuring half-conversations with whatever children dream about, and she had grown so accustomed to them, she barely heard them consciously anymore. The way you stop hearing the clock. He's threatening families with their banknotes, she said. Yes, over a schoolroom. Not over the schoolroom, Garrick said. He sat down in the chair she'd indicated without her needing to indicate it twice, which was a recent development 3 months ago. He'd stayed at the door until she said, "Come in, sit down." Now he came in and sat when she gestured. She didn't know what to make of that, except that it seemed like a reasonable evolution. Over me, he said. The school is just the lever he found. Tell me about you and Pike, she said. Not around it. Tell me. He looked at the stove for a moment. 6 years ago, there was a stretch of bad weather that hit the smaller ranches hard. Lost stock, lost revenue, some of them barely holding on. Pike's bank held the notes on 3 of those ranches. When the owners came in for extensions, he denied all 3 and foreclosed. Took the land at well under value and turned it within a year. He paused. 2 of those families had worked their properties for 15 years. One of them, the Draytons, their oldest boy, was in my employ at the time. I watched what the foreclosure did to them. You said something to Pike. In front of half the town council, he said, not calmly. She absorbed this, and he's been waiting. He's a patient man, Garrick said. More patient than me, which is useful for him. Is there anything he can actually do to Iron Hollow? Legally? Our notes aren't with his bank. That was deliberate, years ago. He looked at her. He can't touch the land. But he can make the town a place where Iron Hollow isn't welcome to do business. He can make our workers' families feel like they're choosing between this ranch and a life in Ash Creek. His jaw tightened slightly. And he can make it so that any woman who works for me is talked about in a way that makes her job here impossible. The last sentence hung in the air between them for a moment. He's not going to make my job impossible, she said. Lenore, I mean it. She looked at him directly. She had gotten used to looking at him directly, which was its own kind of evolution. In the first weeks, she'd been careful about eye contact not from fear, but from instinct, from the same cautiousness that made you not lean on a railing until you'd tested its hold. She had tested Garrick Holt thoroughly over 3 months. The railing held. I am not going to be run off by a man who has never spent a single minute in my classroom and doesn't know the first thing about what I'm building there. What you're building there, he said, and something in his voice when he said it was different from usual. Yes, she said. Mine too. Not just yours. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, the Harper and Suggs children are staying. I'll talk to their fathers tomorrow. not pressuring them, explaining what Pike's doing, what their choice actually is. Don't tell them to stay for my sake, she said. I wasn't going to, he stood. I was going to tell them to stay for their kids' sake. That's a different argument. She nodded. He went to the door. Then he turned and said something she didn't expect, Lenora. When your husband wrote to you about Nolan, what did he say exactly? If you're willing to tell me. She was quiet for a moment. Nobody had asked her about Daniel's letter in the 3 months since she'd arrived. She'd volunteered a few pieces of it, here and there, to people who needed to know pieces of it, but nobody had asked about it as a complete thing. He said, family keeps its word, she said. He said Nolan was difficult, but that when it mattered, he understood obligation. She paused. Daniel believed that about people. He believed they would rise to a thing when the thing was real enough. He was wrong about Nolan. He was wrong about Nolan, she agreed. Garrick was quiet for a moment. Was he right about people in general, do you think? She considered it honestly. Sometimes, she said, often enough to make it worth assuming. He nodded slowly. Left. She closed the door and stood there in the warmth of her own cabin and allowed herself to notice, just briefly, and without making anything of it, that the conversation they'd just had was nothing like any conversation she'd had with any man since Daniel died. Not because it was romantic, it wasn't. Not exactly. Not yet. She refused to let herself use that word yet. But because it had been between two people of roughly equal weight. She hadn't been managed or pitied or talked around. She had been spoken to. She went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks, which was either a good sign or evidence that she was making something complicated out of something she should be keeping simple, and she chose not to decide which. Spring came to Wyoming like it always did, reluctantly. By degrees, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes, while the north sides stayed hard and white well into April. The river that ran along the eastern edge of the valley began to move again, which Floyd referred to as the river waking up, and which Lenora's students found an irresistible source of distraction from mathematics. The school had recovered from the Caldwell departure. Most of its windows were dark. The Harper and Suggs children had stayed, their fathers apparently finding Garrick's version of the conversation persuasive. And 3 weeks' windows were dark, and 3 weeks after the Caldwells left, 2 families from the smaller homesteads up the valley road had appeared at the schoolroom door to ask if their children might be admitted. They'd heard, through the specific underground telegraph of rural women, that there was a teacher at Iron Hollow who wasn't just going through motions. Lenora had admitted them. 9 students became 11. She reorganized the room to accommodate, moved 2 benches, wrote to a teacher's college in Cheyenne explaining her situation and asking if there were any donated materials available, and received 3 weeks later a crate of textbooks that had seen better days, but were structurally intact and full of usable content. She did not tell Garrick about the letter to Cheyenne or the crate. She just incorporated the textbooks into the school and kept going. He noticed anyway. He noticed most things which she had also filed. New books, he said one Thursday morning when he stopped in the doorway of the school room to tell her something about the supply wagon schedule. Donated from Cheyenne, she said, without turning from the board where she was writing a grammar problem. You arranged that? Yes. A pause. When did you have time? After the children were in bed, he was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to need a bigger space. She turned around at that. I'm sorry? 11 children in here is getting crowded. If more come... I'm aware of the geometry, Garrick. I'm saying I can build you a bigger space. She looked at him. That's a significant expense. It is, he said. I'm aware of the economics. His expression did something she'd learned to identify as the thing his face did when he'd already made a decision and was waiting for confirmation that the decision was acceptable. The Caldwell space isn't going to hold what you're building here. I'd rather expand now than have you working in a room that's too small and losing students because of it. She opened her mouth to say something cautious about resources and timing. Then she closed it, because what she actually felt underneath the caution was gratitude that had no clean or simple way of expressing itself. Let me draw what I'd need, she said instead. Before anyone starts building, let me draw the actual space and we'll go from there. Fair enough, he said, and left. She was drawing the schoolroom layout that evening when the first serious piece of news arrived. Came not from town, but from a rider who'd come down from the mountain passes, a trapper named Cull, who passed through Iron Hollow twice a year and who had a taste for Ida's coffee and a reliable sense for things worth reporting. The logging dam upriver, he said. The one built by the Eastern Timber Company 7 years ago. He'd gone past it that morning, and it didn't look right. Didn't look right how, Garrick said. Cole put down his coffee cup. He was a weathered, deliberate man, the kind who doesn't embellish. Been a lot of mountain snow this winter, he said, and it's been coming off fast this last 3 weeks. Faster than usual. There's water backed up behind that dam that I wouldn't want to bet my house on. The dam has held for 7 years, Floyd said from the corner. 7 years of normal snowpack, Cole said. This wasn't normal snowpack. Garrick was quiet. He looked at the wall, the particular way he looked at walls, when he was mapping something in his head. What kind of timeline are you thinking? I'm a trapper, Cole said. Not an engineer, but if I had anything valuable in the floodplain between that dam and the creek bend, I'd be thinking about moving it. He picked up his coffee again. Sooner rather than later. Cole left the following morning. Garrick went up to look at the dam himself 2 Tuesdays later, took Floyd and 2 other ranch hands, came back in the late afternoon, and went directly to find Lenora, which was the part she noticed. Not Floyd first, not the hands. She was in the schoolroom cleaning the board at the end of a long day. Thomas was in the corner drawing horses on a scrap of paper with the focused disregard for reality that 5-year-olds bring to drawing horses. The other students had gone. Garrick came in and stood for a moment, and she knew from the way he stood that the news was not reassuring. Tell me, she said. The dam has damage, he said. The eastern face has a breach, developing not open yet, but significant. The snowmelt is running faster than the drainage channels were designed to handle. He paused. I think Cull was right. How much water are we talking about? He looked at Thomas briefly. Thomas was still drawing. Enough to reach town, he said. If it goes. She felt the sentence settle in her chest, the weight of it. How much warning would we have? Hard to say. Hours, maybe. Could be a day or 2 if it holds longer. He looked at her. I need to think about what to do. I wanted to talk it through. She pulled up one of the student chairs and sat in it, and he sat in another, which meant they were both sitting in chairs that were slightly too small for adults, which under different circumstances would have been almost funny. She looked at the floor for a moment, thinking. The town needs to know, she said. Yes, Pike is not going to make that easy. No. If you Gove's windows were dark, you go into Ash Creek and tell them there's a flood risk, the first thing half of them are going to think is that you're trying to manipulate something, undermine something. She looked up. Because Pike has spent months making them think that's the kind of man you are. Garrick's jaw tightened. I'm aware. So you need to go anyway, she said. And you need to be specific and factual and not ask for anything in return. And some of them are still going to look at you sideways, and you do it anyway. I know, he said. I'm not telling you something you don't know, she said. I'm saying it out loud because, she paused, because sometimes that helps. Knowing the thing and saying the thing are different. He looked at her. The afternoon light through the schoolroom windows was the long, thin light of late March, the kind that comes in at an angle and catches dust and makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. He looked at her in that light for a moment and then said yes. They are. She went into town with him. He hadn't asked her to. She'd simply said she was coming, the following morning when he was preparing the wagon. He'd looked at her and said, you don't have to, and she'd said, I know, and climbed up. The towns received the news the way towns receive news they suspect might be true, but wish weren't with mixture of alarm, skepticism, and the particular irritation people feel when they're being asked to act on information that would be easier to ignore. The town council met in the back room of the hardware store. Garrick presented what he'd seen at the dam. He was factual. He was precise. He did not ask for anything. He said that in his judgment, the dam represented a genuine risk to properties in the floodplain, which included approximately a third of Ash Creek's buildings and the eastern farmland beyond it. Most of its windows were dark, and that he thought the town needed to send someone with proper engineering knowledge to assess it, and that families in the lower areas should begin thinking about what they would do if they needed to move fast. The skepticism was immediate, and some of it came wearing Amos Pike's face. Pike sat at the far end of the table, and he listened to all of it, with the attentiveness of a man cataloging ammunition, and when Garrick finished, he said, With a measured reasonableness that was considerably more dangerous than open hostility, the Iron Hollow Dam has been standing since 1880. Engineers approved it. We've had hard winters before. Not like this winter, Garrick said. Mr. Holt, I don't doubt you want to be helpful. Pike's tone was the careful kind, not quite condescending, just slightly superior in the way that costs nothing to claim. But there are people in this room whose businesses and homes you'd have them evacuate based on your opinion of a dam you saw from the outside. I didn't say evacuate. Garrick kept his voice even with visible effort. I said prepare. Preparedness we can certainly discuss, Pike said, in the tone people use when they mean to discuss nothing. The meeting ended without resolution. The council agreed to consider sending an assessment party to look at the dam sometime in the next 2 weeks, which Lenora understood meant the next 2 weeks might include a flood, and that would be the assessment. She said nothing during the meeting. She was not a council member, she had no standing in that room, and she understood that Garrick speaking for himself was already a difficult enough argument without her creating a second one. But she watched Pike throughout. She watched the way he managed the room, not through force, through something more sophisticated than force, through the careful cultivation of doubt. He never once said the dam was fine. He said only that they couldn't be sure it wasn't. Reasonable-sounding things can do terrible damage when they're deployed in service of inaction. On the drive back to Iron Hollow, Garrick didn't speak for almost a mile. Then he said, "They're not going to do anything." "Not in time," she agreed. Another silence. "I have 3 families in the floodplain who aren't on my property," he said. "The Harpers, the old Draytons, and Mrs. Elborough, who's a widow of about 70. Who's been in the same house since before this town had a proper name." He paused. "And then there's the lower quarter of Ash Creek itself." "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking about the irrigation embankment on the south field," he said. "The one that took 3 years to build." She turned to look at him. "If the dam goes and the water runs the natural channel," he said, "it follows the valley floor. It hits the lower town first, then fans east toward the river. But if you were to cut that embankment before it floods," he stopped, "the water would have somewhere else to go. It'd take the south field, flood it completely, maybe ruin it for a season, maybe 2. But it redirects enough of the volume that the main channel pressure drops. Town might stay dry." She understood what he was describing. She understood it in the flat, clear way of someone who grew up in terrain that took things from people. "That's your best grazing land," she said. "Yes, and the irrigation embankment alone is 3 years of work and a significant sum of money," he said. "Yes." "Garrick." "I know," he said. "The town didn't even listen to you tonight. I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment. The road was dark ahead of them, the horses finding it by familiarity. "When were you going to decide this?" She said. "I think I already decided it," he said. "I wanted to see if the council would make it unnecessary." A pause. They didn't. She turned forward again. "The stars out here were thick and white and indifferent in the way stars are when you most want them to offer something. You'll lose half a season's income, possibly more. And some people in that town will still believe Pike over you. Probably." She didn't tell him it was the right decision. He knew it was the right decision. He didn't need her to confirm it, and she wasn't in the habit of confirming things people already knew just to make them feel better about knowing. But she did say quietly, "I have my husband's survey maps from this valley. He did some mapping work before the mining company moved him on. I don't know if they're accurate enough to be useful, but they show the valley drainage patterns." He looked at her. "You have those?" "In the trunk." She paused. "I can look at them tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "Then thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "They might be wrong." They weren't wrong. Daniel Vance had been many things that complicated her life, most of them rooted in the same excess of optimism that had sent him chasing a mining operation that couldn't sustain them. But he had also been meticulous about maps. He loved maps with the devotion of someone for whom a piece of paper showing the shape of a place was as interesting as the place itself, and his survey notes on the lower Ash Creek Valley were detailed enough that when Lenora spread them on the table at the main house that night, with Garrick and Floyd and Samuel, who had appeared, uninvited, but with the instinct of becoming a man all leaning over it, she could trace the presect with reasonable confidence. "If the dam goes completely," she said, putting her finger on the point of likely failure, The primary water volume runs here. She traced the valley floor east toward the main channel. The lower two streets of Ash Creek are directly in the path. The South Field embankment is here. She moved her hand. If you cut it here, the water finds this lower gradient and spreads across the field rather than channeling into town. Does it slow enough? Floyd asked. It reduces the channeling effect, she said. It doesn't eliminate the risk. The creek will still rise. But the catastrophic surge the wall of water that takes structures, that's the thing we're trying to prevent. Floyd looked at Garrick. Garrick was looking at the map. It works, Garrick said, not triumphantly, just factually. It works if we can get people in the lower town to higher ground first, Lenora said. Because even with the diversion, the creek will flood. It just won't take everything. How long do we have? Samuel asked. He said it quietly, looking at the map with the same intense focus he'd been bringing to Floyd's livestock work since January. The focus of a boy trying very hard to learn things fast enough to be useful. Don't know, Garrick said. The dam could hold another week. It could go tomorrow. He straightened up. I'm going to start moving the ranch livestock tonight. High ground east of the property. He looked at Floyd. Get Martinez and Brennan up. I want the horses moved before midnight. Floyd left without comment. Garrick looked at Lenora, then at San Samsuel. I need someone who can ride fast to the outlying homesteads on the west side of the valley, the ones too small to know about the risk. I can ride, Samuel said immediately. Samuel, Lenora said, Mom, I can ride and I know where the homesteads are because Floyd took me past them in November. She looked at him at his jaw, set with that particular 13-year-old determination that was equal parts courage and insufficient awareness of consequences. And she thought about all the ways this could go wrong, and she thought about all the ways that not doing it could go wrong. And she said, you take one of the ranch hands with you. You don't go alone. Martinez's older boy can go, Garrick said quietly. Samuel looked at his mother. She nodded once. He was already moving before the nod was complete. The next 18 hours were the most frightening of Lenora's life, and she had recently had some very strong competition for that title. The rain started at 3 in the morning, not the normal spring rain that comes in gentle and persistent, but the kind that arrives like something that has been stored too long under too much pressure. It hit the ranch roof hard and steady and did not let up. By dawn, the ground that had been beginning to soften with spring was saturated past the point of absorption, and water was sheeting across the flat places in thin, moving films that found the low places with terrible accuracy. Garrick had sent 2 men into town the evening before to warn people again. Pike's response, relayed through a ranch hand who'd overheard it in the general store, was that Garrick was crying wolf for reasons of his own, and that reasonable people should wait for the council's assessment. The water didn't wait. At 6 in the morning, a sound moved through the valley that Lenora had no reference for, not a crash, not a boom, but a deep, sustained concussive pressure that seemed to come from inside the ground rather than above it. Floyd came to the cabin door at a near run, which she had never seen him do before, and which told her more than any words could. Dam's letting go, he said. Or close enough. Get the children, she said. She was already pulling on her coat. What followed was organized only in the sense that panic, when it happens to competent people who have already thought about what to do, looks like organization from the outside. The ranch families moved with the speed of people who had already been warned and had already begun moving things. Martinez had his family to the high east pasture. Before the rain started, Brennan was 2 hours behind him. The elderly Mrs. Elborough from the edge of town, who had finally accepted evacuation when the water began moving across her front step, arrived at Iron Hollow's high ground in a wagon driven by her neighbor's teenage son, sitting upright in the wagon bed with the specific dignity of a very old woman who has decided that if she is going to be carried to safety, she will be carried to safety with her posture intact. Garrick cut the embankment himself, with 2 ranch hands, knee-deep in moving water, at 7:15 in the morning. Lenora knew when it happened because the sound of the water changed the roar that had been building in the channel. Shifted, split, went sideways, and within minutes the south field was gone under a wide, moving sheet of brown water that spread slowly and deliberately like something spilled on a large table. It worked. The channel pressure dropped. The town flooded. The lower two streets took 2 feet of water that ruined floors and stores and the contents of dozens of buildings. The structures held. The creek surge that would have taken them stayed in the south field, soaking into the deep soil, spread wide and slow, instead of channeled and violent. But Garrick was not there to see it confirmed. He had been moving a family, the Tulliver family, the father injured, the mother, with an infant and a 4-year-old, out of their house in the floodplains at the edge of Iron Hollow's property, and he had been doing it fast, loading them onto a wagon, and the road back had been cut off by moving water before he could get clear. Lenora found out from Floyd, who found out from the Martinez boy who had seen Garrick's wagon on the wrong side of the water line from the high ground and had ridden back to report it with the expression of a boy who understood the significance of what he'd seen. He was already at the corral by the time Floyd finished the sentence. "I know the mining ridge," she said. "Daniel's maps show a passage over the East Fork. It runs above the flood line." "It's rough terrain," Floyd said. "Floyd." She was saddling the horse herself. "Who else knows where he is?" "Martinez and his boy. Tell them to bring rope and dry blankets." "I'll go ahead." "Mrs. Vance, tell them," she said, and she was on the horse, and moving before the argument had a chance to form. She had looked at Daniel's maps long enough that the ridge route was in her head as a series of landmarks, rather than a drawn path, a fork of dead cedar, a boulder formation that looked like a collapsed chimney, a dry creek bed that in spring became passable only at its upper section. She moved through them in the rain with the focused single-mindedness of someone who cannot afford to second-guess themselves, because second-guessing costs time and time was the one currency she could not spare. She found them 40 minutes later. Garrick's wagon had been turned over not by flood, by the road itself, which had gone soft and treacherous under the weight and dropped the left wheel into a collapsed culvert. The Tulliver family was on the high side of the wagon. The mother, under a section of canvas Garrick, had pulled over her and the children. Garrick was against the overturned wheel in water that was rising past waist, and he was holding the side of the wagon with both hands in a way that told her his footing was gone and he was keeping himself upright by grip alone. "Garrick?" she said. He looked up. The expression on his face, she would think about it later, when everything was over and she had the space to think about things. It was relief, certainly, but it was more specific than that. It was the specific expression of a man who has been alone with a bad situation and has just seen someone arrive that he did not fully expect to arrive, and the unexpectedness is what moves in the face. "The ridge route," she said, already getting off the horse. "Daniel's maps. It goes above the water line. How certain are you?" "Certain enough to be here," she said. He almost laughed. It came out strange, half swallowed by the rain and his own exhaustion. Fair point. Martinez and his boy arrived 8 minutes behind her with the rope and the blankets. Getting the Tulliver family onto the horses was slow and difficult. The mother was frightened, and the 4-year-old was screaming. And the infant had achieved the particular stillness of infants in crisis that is either concerning or immersive, and is impossible to tell which, and Garrick's left leg had taken a blow from the wagon when it turned that he did not mention until they were halfway up the ridge, and he was limping badly enough that Lenora noticed. "Your leg," she said. "It works," he said. "That's not what I asked." "Hold," he said. And then, because she was still looking at him, "I've had worse." That's also not reassuring. He looked at her sideways in the rain, soaked through, limping, holding onto the ridge path with the careful precision of a man managing pain he's decided not to be stopped by. And he said, "You came out here." "Yes." "In this?" "Also yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Then why?" She considered the honest answer. The things she didn't quite say to herself at the cabin, the things she'd been keeping in the file rather than in her thoughts. She looked at the path ahead and she said, "Because you didn't make me dependent on you. Because you gave me a fair chance to build something real. And people who do that," she paused, "you don't leave them in rising water." He didn't say anything to that. But something happened in his face that had nothing to do with the rain or the pain in his leg, and she filed it carefully, precisely, in the place where she kept the things that mattered. They came down the far side of the ridge at 8:45 in the morning, into the high east pasture, where the Iron Hollow families were waiting in a collection of wagons and canvas shelters, and the general organized disorder of people who have survived something together and are figuring out what comes next. The Tulliver infant had fallen asleep against its mother's chest. The 4-year-old stopped to dark, had stopped screaming, and was eating something Lenora never found out what that Ida Marsh had produced from somewhere. Mrs. Elborough was seated on a wooden crate with her posture still entirely intact, watching the incoming group with the expression of someone keeping score. Garrick came off the ridge last. The ranch families saw him before he reached the flat, and something moved through the group, not a cheer, exactly. More like a settling. The particular collective exhale of people who have been holding something and can now put it down. He was soaked, limping, and covered in mud up to his chest. He looked like what he was, a man who had sacrificed his best land to save a town that had spent 6 months listening to someone else's version of who he was. He stood at the edge of the flat ground and looked at the people he'd built Iron Hollow for, and at Lenora beside him, and at the wide brown water visible in the valley below where his Southfield used to be. And then Floyd appeared at his elbow with a dry coat that Floyd had clearly been keeping dry specifically for this purpose, and held it out without comment, and Garrick put it on, and that was the whole ceremony of it. Samuel appeared beside Lenora. He'd come down from the west, from the homestead circuit, and he was dirty, and his horse was winded, but he was upright and present and whole. And when he reached his mother's side, she put her hand on his shoulder briefly and did not make anything of it because he was 13, and making things of it would embarrass him. But she felt the solid reality of him under her hand, and it was the best thing she had felt since this whole terrible morning began. The water held the valley for 2 days. When it pulled back, what was left was the particular honesty of aftermath, the damage visible and unspun, the true accounting of what had been lost and what had been kept. Iron Hollow's south field was destroyed. The fences were gone. 3 barns that sat in the lower sections of the property had taken water damage severe enough to be questionable. A full season of grazing had been compromised. Ash Creek had wet floors and ruined inventory, and 2 streets of mud that would take weeks to clear. But it was standing. Every family in the town was still in possession of living members. That was the accounting that mattered, and it was one that Amos Pike, seated in his dry office above the flood line, his building had been among those untouched, carefully situated on the ridge above town, was going to find very difficult to spin into anything resembling a narrative about Garrick Holt's character. Because the man Pike had spent months describing as selfish and calculating, had just flooded his own land to save the town that believed it. And everyone left standing in Ash Creek knew it. The mud dried slowly. That was the thing nobody told you about floods, not the water itself, which came fast and left with some urgency once it had done its work. But the aftermath, the mud that settled into everything like a second skin, brown and dense and permanent seeming, coating floorboards and furniture legs and the lower sections of walls with a layer that smelled like the inside of the earth and took weeks to fully remove. Ash Creek smelled like river bottom for a month. People tracked it into their homes on their boots and then tracked it back out again, and the line between inside and outside became temporarily meaningless in the way that disasters tend to make things meaningless. Iron Hollow was not spared the mud. The Southfield was a flat brown lake for 4 days, before the water dropped enough to show the ground beneath, and what the ground showed was not encouraging. The irrigation channels that Garrick's crew had built over 3 years were either collapsed or silted to uselessness. The fencing that had defined the best grazing sections was mostly gone posts standing at irregular intervals, like a sentence with most of its words removed. The 3 lower barns had taken water to shoulder height, and the structural integrity of 2 of them was now a question rather than a certainty. Floyd walked the damage with Garrick on the 3rd day after the water receded, both of them moving in the deliberate way of men who are counting rather than grieving, though the counting was its own kind of grief. Lenora had learned to read Floyd's silences. By now, the man communicated primarily in the quality of his quiet, and the silence he maintained through that walk was the kind that meant the numbers were not resolving into anything comfortable. "Southfield won't graze this season," Floyd said, when they got back to the main house. "I know," Garrick said. "Eastfield is reduced by maybe a third. The flooding came further than I'd expected on the creek side." "I know that, too." Floyd looked at him. You want me to finish the accounting, or did you already do it in your head? I did it in my head last night. And Garrick was quiet for a moment. He was sitting at the main house table with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk, which Lenora, seated across with her own cup and the ranch's ledger book, understood to be a sign of where his mind actually was. We're not going to make it through winter on what we have, he said. Not with reduced grazing capacity, the barn repairs, and the fencing reconstruction. We'd have to sell stock to cover it, which reduces next year's capacity, which means the year after is also compromised. Floyd sat down heavily in the third chair. For a man of 60 who operated largely without complaint, he looked tired in a way that went past the body. Bank? Not Pike's Bank, Garrick said immediately. There's a bank in Cheyenne. At what rate? And against what collateral? Garrick shook his head. We'd be servicing debt for 3 years on a reduced income. That's a slow version of the same problem. The room was quiet. Lenora had been listening and running her own version of the numbers in her head, which was a habit from years of household management on a teacher's salary, the particular arithmetic of people who have never had a margin for error. She had been looking at the ledger, not because Garrick had asked her to, but because, after 4 months, and she had developed opinions about how the ranch operated, and she trusted those opinions enough to act on them. She had been working on something since the night before. I want to show you something, she said. Both men looked at her. She turned the ledger around and slid it across the table. She had been writing in the margins, not in the official columns. For the last hour, in the space beside them, Sput's numbers, structure arranged in a accounting that wasn't exactly planning and wasn't exactly, but was something in between. I've been looking at how the Martinez family runs the North Herd, she said, and the way Floyd managed the east section through the winter independently, essentially, making decisions about rotation without waiting for sign-off each time. That's practical, Floyd said. The time it takes to get sign-off. Right, she said. But right now it's practical because Garrick allows it, not because it's formalized. It means Floyd's judgment has value that isn't reflected in what he's paid. Martinez's knowledge of the North Herd has value that isn't reflected in what he's paid. She looked at Garrick. Same with Ruth Brennan managing the dairy section. Same with how the Yates family has basically been running the equipment maintenance independently. Garrick was looking at the ledger. He hadn't spoken. What if they owned part of it? She said. Floyd looked at her. Not the land, she said quickly, because she could see that was where Floyd's expression was going. Not a deed transfer, a share structure. Each family that's been working this land gets a defined share of the annual profits based on their section's output and their years of contribution. They filled the South Field with us. They maintain their sections through the lean year, and at the end of each year, they receive a percentage of what Iron Hollow earns rather than just a flat wage. They take on risk, Floyd said slowly. They already take on risk, she said. Every one of them. They're already betting their families on this ranch working. This just makes that bet visible and compensated. She looked at Garrick. And it means when there's a bad year, a flood year, you're not carrying the recovery alone. You're carrying it together. Garrick had picked up the ledger. He was reading what she'd written in the margins. His face was doing the wall reading thing, the internal mapping, the numbers moving in his head. How did you calculate these percentages? He said, hours contributed versus output managed, she said. Rough estimates you and Floyd would need to refine them. But the structure holds. He put the ledger down, looked at her. You've been thinking about this since last night? Since the flood, she said. When you were standing at the edge of the east pasture looking at the water in your field. She paused. You didn't look like a man who regretted cutting the embankment. You looked like a man who was worried about the people depending on you. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, someone Samuel probably was working in the near barn. The sound of a shovel hitting wet ground came through at intervals. The ranch had been doing that for 3 days, everyone working, cleaning, assessing, doing the slow physical work of returning order to disrupted things. It's a significant change to how this ranch operates, Garrick said. Yes, she said. Some of the families may not want the risk. Then you give them the choice. You don't require it. You offer it. Floyd leaned back in his chair. He had the expression he got when he was arriving at a conclusion by a route different from the one he'd started on. Martinez would take it, he said. Been here 7 years. He thinks of the north section like it's his already. That's the point, Lenora said. Ruth Brennan would probably take it if her husband agreed. Floyd looked at the ceiling, which he would if Martinez already had. I'll talk to the families, Garrick said. He said it in the tone that meant he had decided, which was a tone she had gotten good at recognizing. He looked at her. Where did you learn cooperative economics? I didn't, she said. I learned household economics. It's the same principles at a different scale. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd been filing for 4 months, the one she still didn't have a clean name for. Then he said, I'm going to need you to stay involved in this. I'm already involved in this, she said. I mean formally. In the operation, she looked at him. I'm a school teacher. You're also the person who last night calculated the profit-sharing structure for a cattle ranch from a ledger you weren't technically authorized to read. She felt something that might have been embarrassment. You left it on the table. Yes, he said. I know I did. A pause. Stay involved, Lenora. Formally, she looked at the ledger, at the numbers in the margins. At the 4 months of accumulated evidence she had that this man did what he said he would do and said clearly what he meant and treated her consistently and without ceremonies, as someone capable of contributing to a serious thing. All right, she said, formally. Conversations with the ranch families happened over the following 2 days, not in one formal meeting, but in the way things actually happen at a working ranch, in pieces, in doorways and beside fence lines and over Ida's supper table. Garrick, moving through the property with the patience of a man who understood that decisions of this kind needed to breathe rather than be presented. Lenora was present for some of them. Not all. Martinez said yes before Garrick finished explaining the structure. He'd been at Iron Hollow 9 years, and he listened to the proposal with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, to hear exactly this. Mi familia, he said, we rebuild the South Field. Same as our own. Same as your own, Garrick said. Ruth Brennan asked 3 clarifying questions about what happened to shares if a family needed to leave, which were good questions and which Garrick answered honestly, including the part where the answers were still being worked out. Ruth looked at her husband, who nodded and said they'd take it. The Yates family took 2 days. Mr. Yates was a methodical man, and he wanted to see the numbers on paper, which Lenora wrote out for him in the kitchen of his cabin on the second evening, while Clara set the table for supper and tried very hard to appear as though she wasn't listening, which she absolutely was. The only person who hesitated was Floyd. Garrick found him in the equipment barn on the second afternoon, which was where Floyd went when he needed to think, because the equipment barn required maintenance attention, and Floyd was constitutionally unable to think without doing something useful at the same time. He was working a leather harness that had gotten stiff with flood water. He didn't look up when Garrick came in. You're going to tell me to take the share, Floyd said. I'm going to offer it to you, Garrick said. Same as everyone. A silence. Floyd worked the leather. I've been paid a wage at this ranch for 11 years, he said. That's a known thing. I know what I'm getting. You know what you're getting in a good year, Garrick said. This year wasn't a good year. My wage was still paid. At cost to me, Garrick said. At cost to the ranch. A share means a bad year cost all of us proportionally. You'd have taken less this year, but you'd own something. I'm 60 years old, Floyd said. He said it the way a man says an age that has become a fact rather than just a number. What do I need to own something for? Because when I'm gone, Garrick said, and this ranch passes to whoever it passes to, I want the people who built it to have something to show for it, not just a history of wage slips. Floyd stopped working the harness. He was quiet for a long time. You planning on going somewhere? He said finally. Not immediately, Garrick said. But nobody plans on going somewhere. Floyd looked at the harness in his hands. Then he said, Ida would tell me to take it. Ida has opinions about most things, Garrick said. She's usually right. Floyd put the harness down. All right, he said. Write it up. And he picked up the harness again, which meant the conversation was over. The recovery of Iron Hollow had a quality to it that was different from simple repair work. It was the difference between fixing a thing you've been assigned to fix and rebuilding a thing you partly own. Martinez's family put in hours in the South Field that nobody asked for, and nobody tracked. They were simply there when the sun came up, and still there when it went down. Ruth Brennan organized the women of the ranch into a systematic cleaning of the lower barns that covered in 2 days what might otherwise have taken a week. Samuel, who was 14 now, his birthday having passed quietly in the work of the flood recovery, worked alongside Floyd and the older ranch hands. With a steadiness that had stopped looking like a boy, trying to be useful, and started looking like a young man who simply was. He'd changed her oldest. She watched it happening. Single moment, but in the accumulation of them, the way he'd ridden out in the flood warning to the homesteads without hesitation, the way he'd come down from the ridge and gone immediately to help Mrs. Elborough's evacuation without being asked, the way he moved through the ranch now with the assurance of someone who knew their place in a place and was at ease in it. He still had the old soul face that had worried her in the first weeks. But the worry in it was different now. Less trapped, more purposeful. It was Eli who surprised her. 8-year-old Eli, who had spent the first 2 months at Iron Hollow in a state of cautious observation that had made Lenora wonder if he was developing into a withdrawn child, a thing she'd been quietly watching with the part of her mind that never fully stopped. Being a teacher had, in the aftermath of the flood, become inexplicably social. He had attached himself to Peter Martinez, who was 10 and unaccountably patient with him, and together they had apparently decided to inventory every piece of usable salvage in the flood debris. They brought their findings to Floyd each afternoon with the seriousness of small men conducting an important report. Floyd listened to every word without expression and said good work in a tone that suggested he meant it and then went back to whatever he was doing. Eli came home each evening exhausted and pleased in the way that children are pleased when the world has accepted them as participants. And Thomas, her youngest, her gap-toothed talker, had become inexplicably devoted to the Tulliver infant. Mrs. Tulliver, whose husband had recovered fully from his flood injuries, after 2 weeks at the ranch, had stayed on temporarily while their home dried out, and Thomas had appointed himself the baby's official observer. He reported its activities to Lenora at dinner, with the gravity of someone delivering dispatches. She made a noise like a cat today, he informed her on a Wednesday. Good? I think she's happy, he said. Her face did the happy thing. Did it. I made a funny face at her, and she looked at me for a long time, he said. I think she likes me. I think you're probably right, Lenora said. He ate 3 more bites, then said, without particular lead-up, is this where we live now? She looked at him. He was asking it the same way he'd asked everything since they'd arrived, with the direct simplicity of a child who hasn't yet learned to dress questions in social clothing. Yes, she said. This is where we live now. He nodded, went back to eating. Apparently that was sufficient. She held that for a moment, the simplicity of it. Yes, this is where we live now. She had not been able to say that about any place in the 14 months since Daniel died. Most of its windows were dark. The truth of being able to say it sat in her chest like something she'd been carrying that she'd just been allowed to put down. What she did not know, sitting at that table with her boys, was that the following morning was going to deliver something she had not prepared herself for. Nolan Vance came to Iron Hollow at 7 in the morning. She was at the schoolroom, preparing for the day, when Ida Marsh appeared in the doorway with an expression she'd never worn before, not quite neutral, not quite protective, somewhere between the two. You've got a visitor, Ida said, at the main house. Something in her voice made Lenora stop what she was doing. Who? Ida looked at her steadily. Your husband's brother. The room didn't change. The morning light through the south windows stayed exactly as it was. The papers in Lenora's hands remained papers. But something in the air went tight. He came here, she said. He's in the kitchen, Ida said. I didn't invite him past the door, but I also didn't set him on fire, which I want you to know required some self-control on my part. Lenora put down the papers, straightened her coat. She had approximately the length of the walk from the schoolroom to the main house to decide how she was going to handle this, which was not a great deal of time, but it would have to be enough. Nolan Vance looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed when she came into the kitchen and found him standing near the door with his hat in his hands. He had seemed large on his porch in January, large in the way people seem large when they have something you need and are choosing not to give it. Now he was just a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with the look of someone who had not been sleeping well, standing in another man's kitchen, trying to figure out where to put his eyes. He looked up when she came in. Lenora, he said. Nolan, she said. She did not offer him a seat. I heard about the flood, he said. I heard what happened. What? He stopped. Started again in the way people do when they have prepared something, and then found, at the moment of delivery, that it doesn't fit the actual shape of the situation. I heard what Garrick Holt did. With the embankment, he saved the lower town, she said, including your building. A muscle moved in Nolan's jaw. Yes, Lenora was quiet. She was letting him carry the weight of it, which was where it belonged. I've been hearing things, he said. Since you came. School, the flood, the way things have... He stopped again. He looked at his hat. I've been hearing things and I have been unable to... The sentence failed a third time. He pressed his lips together. I know what I did, he said finally. Night in January. I know what I did, do you? She said. Her voice was not warm. She wasn't ready for it to be warm. Because what you did, Nolan, was close a door on your brother's children in a blizzard. Not on me. On them. They were cold and frightened and they had nothing, and you looked at them and closed the door. She paused. I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. He flinched. It was a small flinch, physical and involuntary, the kind that can't be performed. Yes, he said. That's what I did. Why are you here? He looked up at her. His eyes were red at the edges, which she noticed and chose not to soften toward yet. Because Pike has been in my store 3 times in the last 2 months, he said, telling me things about you, about Garrick, asking me to confirm things I knew weren't true. She went very still. He came to me because he thought I'd be useful, Nolan said. Because I'm Daniel's brother, and if I said something against you, it would look like family knowledge, like something real. He swallowed. He wanted me to say that you'd talked about Carol Holt before Daniel died, that you'd known about this ranch, that you came here deliberately. And what did you say? She said. I didn't say anything, he said. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, and he left. He looked at her. But I didn't correct him either. I didn't go to anyone and say what was actually true. That you came to Ash Creek looking for family, and I turned you away. He paused. I let his story sit there, filling up the space where the truth was supposed to be. The kitchen was very quiet. Ida had made herself absent, which was its own kind of gift. You came here to tell me this, Lenora said. I came here because he stopped, looked at his hat again. Because Daniel wrote to me, he said, before he died. Different letter than the one he wrote you, I think. He wrote to me asking me to look after you if something happened. And I wrote back and told him I couldn't take on obligations. He looked up. That was the last letter I sent my brother. Lenora breathed in slowly. I have been living with that letter for 8 months, Nolan said. What I said and what I did after. He looked at her with the specific misery of someone who has arrived at a reckoning they cannot postpone any further. I can't fix it. I know I can't fix it. But Pike is still out there telling lies, and the least I can do, the absolute least I owe, is to tell the truth loudly enough that it does some damage to what he's built. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he stopped being able to hold her gaze and looked away. You'll go to the town council, she said. Yes. Not just quietly tell people. Council. On record. Yes. And you'll say what you told me. Exactly. That I came here looking for help from Daniel's family. That you turned me away. That Pike approached you to corroborate a story that wasn't true. Yes, Nolan said. His voice was thin, yes, all of it. She looked at him for another moment. She felt a great many things. Anger that had been sitting quietly since January. Something complicated that might eventually become pity, though it wasn't there yet. And underneath both of those, something that was not forgiveness, not yet, not easily. That was not the kind of thing that happened in a morning, but was the recognition that the truth being told out loud had a value that was separate from whether she forgave the person telling it. The boys need to know you were here, she said. I know. Not today, she said. Today is a school day and they don't need this in their heads during mathematics. But soon. However you think is best, he said. I'll think about how much to tell Thomas. He's 5 and he doesn't carry things the way the older ones do. She paused. Samuel is going to be angry. He should be. He's also becoming a good young man, she said. And she said it not as a comfort to Nolan, but as a fact that deserved to be stated. In spite of January, or maybe partly because of it, because of what it required of him. Nolan looked at her with the expression of someone receiving something they have no right to and know it. Lenora, he said. I'm sorry, I know you are, she said. That's not the same thing as being forgiven. But it's a start. She moved toward the door. Come to the schoolroom at noon. Meet the boys yourself. Whatever you say to them is between you and them. I'm not going to manage it. That's fair, he said. That's more than fair. She left him there and walked back across the yard to the schoolroom, where 7 children were waiting for her, with the impatience of people who have somewhere to be, which was itself a kind of gift, the impatience of the ordinary morning, pulling her back to the work that was still hers to do. Nolan Vance went to the Ash Creek Town Council 11 days later. He'd asked for a formal session, which the council had to grant him by its own rules, and he came in and sat down and told the truth in the straightforward way of a man who has decided that brevity is the most honest form the truth can take. He said that Lenora Vance was his dead brother's widow. He said she had arrived in Ash Creek in January seeking refuge for her children, and had come to him first, as Daniel had instructed her to, and he had turned her away. He said that he had never had any indication that she knew Garrett Holt before arriving in Ash Creek, or that she had come here for any reason other than desperation and the reasonable expectation of family help. He said Amos Pike had come to him twice asking him to lend credibility to a different account of events, and that he had refused, but that he was standing here now to say it clearly on record, because silence had already cost him too much. He said all of this in a room that included most of the council members who had spent 6 months making small and large decisions based on the version of events Pike had constructed, and he said it in a voice that did not waver, which was possibly the bravest thing Nolan Vance had ever done. He was not present at the session. He heard about it the same way. He heard about most things through the network of people whose good opinion he'd cultivated over years. What he heard was that the network was reshaping itself in ways that were not favorable to him. The reaction in Ash Creek was not the dramatic pivot of a town suddenly and fully understanding it had been wrong. It was slower and more complicated than that, because real things are. But it was real. The woman who had avoided Lenora's eyes in the general store for 3 months now met them. The man who had pulled his children from the school came to Lenora's door on a Saturday and stood on the step and said, without embellishment, that he thought he'd made an error. She told him his children could come back Monday. He said he'd send them. He sent them. The Harper and Suggs families had never left, and now they spoke louder about the school in town, which had its own cumulative effect. It was Ruth Brennan who told Lenora about a conversation she'd overheard in the dry goods store. 2 women talking about the school, about what their children had said about it, about whether it might be worth sending their own children even though they lived 4 miles out. They're thinking about it, Ruth said. 2 more families, maybe 3. How far out, Lenora said. 4 miles, maybe 5. Lenora looked at her classroom, at the benches and the 3 south windows and the board that Henry Brennan had drawn a very inaccurate horse on during free reading that she hadn't fully erased. We're going to need that larger building, she said. I know, Ruth said with a small smile that meant she'd been thinking the same thing for a while. Garrick had been thinking the same thing longer than either of them. He had gotten more careful about his leg since the flood. Floyd had finally convinced him to let the doctor from 2 towns over-examine it, and the doctor had said the bone was bruised rather than broken, but that doing the amount of physical work Garrick had done directly after the injury had not been a constructive choice, a sentence Floyd had repeated back to Garrick on at least 3 separate occasions. He was not limping badly now, but he moved differently than he had before, with the slightly deliberate care of a man who has been reminded that his body has opinions that deserve consideration. He came to find Lenora on a Thursday evening, not at the cabin, but at the schoolroom, where she was still working by lamp after the children had gone. He started finding her there in the evenings more often than he found her at the cabin, which was a shift she'd noticed and he'd noticed, and neither of them had said anything about. He sat in one of the student chairs. He did this now, without asking, without ceremony, and she kept working for a few minutes before she looked up. The building plan, he said. I know, she said. Ruth told me about the families from out east. More than that, he said. There are settlements south of the ridge, 3 or 4 of them, 30-40 families who've never had school access. Not here, not anywhere. He paused. If we build properly, we could serve those settlements. She looked at him. You're talking about something significantly larger than a school for ranch children. I'm talking about a valley schoolhouse, he said. The first proper one. He said it flatly, factually, but she could hear what was under the facts. The thing I want to build, the lasting thing. The part of Iron Hollow that I'd be most, he stopped. Most proud of? She said. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the word, in the way people are when a word is accurate and they're not used to using accurate words about themselves. Yes, he said. She looked at her papers, at the attendance ledger that now held names she hadn't expected 6 months ago, at the arithmetic workbook she'd made for Peter Martinez, hand-copied by lamplight, because the textbooks from Cheyenne hadn't included anything at his level. How much land, she said. I've got a flat section on the north side of the property, he said, close enough to the road that families from outside can reach it without crossing ranch land. Good orientation for windows. Orientation for windows, she said. You've been thinking about this. Since February, he said. Since you told me your classroom needed 3 south-facing windows. She looked at him. The lamp windows were dark. The lamp between them was the kind of light that didn't flatter anything. It was just honest light, showing faces as they were, showing lines and tiredness, and the particular quality of someone's eyes when they're not performing for an audience. He was looking at her steadily in that light. There's something I want to say, he said, and I want to say it directly because I have found that the times I've failed to say things directly have been the times I've regretted most. She set down her pen. I am not certain of the right way to say this, he said, which is unusual for me, generally. He looked at the lamp for a moment, then back at her. What you have done here, not what I did, not what the flood required, not what the share agreement or the council or any of it required, but what you specifically have done here, in this building, with those children. What you've built. He paused. I have been watching it for months, and I cannot find the right. Garrick, she said quietly. He stopped. I know, she said. Just that. The silence between them was the kind that has weather in it. Not uncomfortable. Something more honest than comfortable, which is different, and in its own way better. Schoolhouse, she said eventually. I want 3 windows per wall on the south and east faces. And a proper door, a real door, not repurposed lumber. Done, he said. And a supply room at the back. Not a closet. A room. Done. And I want to be part of designing it, she said. From the beginning. Not consulted at the end, involved from the beginning. He looked at her with that expression again. The one she'd been filing for 4 months. The one she'd been keeping careful and separate from the place where conclusions are drawn. Because she'd been careful, she'd been disciplined. She'd not allowed herself to lean on a railing she hadn't fully tested. But 4 months of evidence had arrived in this room, in this lamplight, and she was a woman who believed in evidence. Involved from the beginning, he said. Yes. She nodded, picked up her pen. I'll start drawing plans tomorrow, she said. Good to go. At the door, he paused the way he always paused at doors, with the particular quality of a man who has one more thing but is weighing whether to say it. The share structure, he said. You did that. We did that, she said. The accounting, he said. The margins of the ledger. The thing that saved this ranch from the kind of debt that would have taken years to clear. She looked up at him. I want you to know, he said, that I am aware of who built what here. It's not a conversation I'm capable of having entirely right now, but I wanted you to know that I know. She looked at him for a moment. I know you know, she said. He nodded once. Left. She sat in the schoolroom for a while after he was gone, in the honest lamplight, not working. Just sitting with the particular weight of the evening, which was considerable and not unpleasant. Outside, Iron Hollow made its usual nighttime sounds: horses, distant cattle, wind in the fence line. The sounds she'd been hearing for 5 months, and which had arranged themselves in her ears into something that could only be called familiar. She had come to this valley with $19 and a dead man's letter and 3 hungry children and the word of a stranger who hadn't looked away when he made his offer. She had built a school out of rope and salvaged lumber. She had kept records in ledger margins. She had ridden a mining ridge in a flood. He had watched her sons find themselves in a place that treated them as people who belonged. She had not been saved. She had been given a level surface, and she had built on it, and those were entirely different things, and she understood the difference in her bones. Amos Pike resigned from the Ash Creek Town Council 6 weeks after Nolan's testimony, citing business concerns, which was a form of words that nobody in town failed to understand. His influence had not disappeared overnight. These things never do. But it had developed significant and holes through which the actual truth of things was beginning to show. 2 of the merchants who had previously avoided Iron Hollow business quietly resumed their accounts. A third sent word through a mutual party, which was a coward's form of apology, but still technically an apology. Pike remained in Ash Creek for another year, his presence shrinking steadily, before he sold his business interests and relocated to somewhere east that nobody in Ash Creek ever confirmed. He left without a formal departure and without anyone making much of his going, which was perhaps the most accurate summary of what his time in Ash Creek had ultimately meant. Nobody at Iron Hollow said his name much after that. They were too busy building to spend time on what had tried to stop them. The schoolhouse broke ground in May, on the flat section of the north property, with the entire ranch community present, and 3 families from the eastern settlements, who had driven out specifically to see it started. It was going to be a real building, proper timber frame, 4 walls that would hold against Wyoming winters, windows in the places Lenora had specified, a supply room at the back that was a room and not a closet. Floyd drove the first stake. He did it without comment, which was how Floyd preferred to mark things of significance. Lenora stood at the edge of the cleared ground and watched the staking begin, with Thomas attached to her left hand and Eli standing beside her with his serious face on, and Samuel a few feet back, arms crossed, watching in the way he watched things now with a quiet attention, of someone who understood what he was looking at. The ground was soft and generous under the first week of May. The sky above the valley was the particular blue that comes after a hard winter, the kind that looks like something that had to be earned. And at Iron Hollow Ranch, in the 5th month after a widow, with 3 sons and $19, had crossed a frozen street toward a stranger's wagon, the building of something permanent had begun. The schoolhouse took 4 months to build. Not because the work was slow, the ranch families and 3 crews from the eastern settlements worked it hard through June heat and July storms, and the particular August exhaustion that comes from sustained physical effort in a place that doesn't cool down much at night. It took 4 months because a real building built to last requires that kind of time. You can't rush timber framing. You can't hurry a foundation set in honest ground. Lenora had learned that about building things, the ones worth having take the time they take, and shortcuts show up later in the walls. She was there for most of it. Not supervising, that was Floyd's domain, and he defended it with the quiet authority of a man who has strong opinions about plumb lines. But she was there with her drawings, the plans she'd made at the kitchen table over 3 weeks in May, refining dimensions, moving the supply room, relocating the windows until the light fell exactly the way she wanted it. She had never designed a building before. What she had was the accumulated knowledge of someone who had taught in 4 different rooms over the years and understood, from the inside, what made a learning space work and what made it punishing. 3 south windows, 1 east, a door that opened fully and did not stick in winter, ceilings high enough that the room didn't feel like a box by mid-afternoon, shelves built into the north wall, not added afterward as an apology. Floyd looked at her drawings the first time and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "You've got the door opening the wrong direction." "It opens out," she said, "for fire egress." Another pause. "That's correct," he said, with the tone of a man updating his assessment of a person. And he went back to work. The building went up through the summer, while the ranch rebuilt itself around it. The south field, the one Garrick had flooded to save the town, was slower to recover than everything else. The irrigation channels had to be rebuilt from the ground up, which was the most labor-intensive work on the property and the least dramatic, just the daily grind of men moving dirt and laying stone in the heat. The Martinez family took the Southfield reconstruction as personally as Garrick had taken the original damage, which meant it got done with a thoroughness that would have been difficult to specify in a contract. By late August, the first sections were operational again. Not at full capacity that was going to take another season, but enough that the cattle could use the pasture and the ranch could stop holding its breath. The share structure was working in the way that things work when they're built on a true idea rather than a convenient one. Not smoothly, nothing involving multiple families, and a complex accounting system worked smoothly but honestly. There were arguments about section output calculations that got loud enough to require Garrick's presence. There was a genuine dispute between the Yates and Brennan families about the boundary line of their respective sections that took 2 weeks and Floyd's intervention to resolve. Mr. Yates was wrong about the boundary, and he knew he was wrong, but he needed time to arrive at knowing it, which Floyd gave him while making absolutely clear that the time had a limit. But after each argument, the work continued, because the people doing it had a reason to continue that was theirs, and not just Garrick's. Most of its windows were dark. That was the thing Lenora had understood from the beginning, the thing she'd seen in the margins of the ledger before she'd ever said it out loud. A wage gives a person a reason to show up. A share gives them a reason to care what happens after they leave for the night. She had been right about that. She was learning to say that more cleanly that she had been right without the reflexive qualification. That was a habit from years of being a woman in rooms where women's assessments were treated as suggestions rather than conclusions. She'd been right. The share structure had saved the ranch. She had designed it, and she had been right. It was Ida Marsh who told her, on an August evening, when the two of them were doing the kind of company that doesn't require continuous conversation, that Garrick had said almost exactly those words to Floyd the week before. He said that? Lenora said. He said she was right, Ida confirmed, which from Garrick is essentially a speech. Lenora looked at her cup. He also said, Ida continued, in a tone that was carefully not anything, that the ranch wouldn't have made it without her. The ranch would have found a way, Lenora said. Maybe, Ida said, but this way was better. She looked at Lenora with the directness she'd always used, which was one of the things Lenora valued most about her. You know what he's building up to. Lenora says nothing. I'm not asking you what you feel about it, Ida said. That's yours, I'm just saying. The man is building up to something. And I've known him 11 years, and I've never seen him build up to anything before. So, whatever it is, it's real. She said it with the economy of someone delivering accurate information, which was how Ida said most things. And then she refilled both their cups and changed the subject, because she was also a person who understood exactly when to leave something alone. The schoolhouse opened on a Monday in September, on a morning that was cool enough to be comfortable and bright enough to show south windows off properly, which Lenora suspected was not an accident of timing, but didn't verify. There were 19 students on the first day. Not 9, not 11, 19. Children from the ranch families, children from the eastern settlements, 2 children from a homestead south of the ridge, whose parents had driven an hour and a half to get them there, arriving before dawn. Clarence was 14 now and had been Yates assigned the role of classroom assistant, which was a role Lenora had invented specifically for her, because Clara needed something the basic curriculum couldn't give her anymore. She was going to need a real school, eventually a proper secondary institution, something that could take what Clara was and give it somewhere to go. Lenora had already written 2 letters about it and was waiting on replies. Henry Brennan sat in the front row and did not talk while Lenora was talking for the first time in recorded history, which Lenora suspected was related to the fact that his mother had said something to him the night before, but whatever the cause, she accepted the outcome. Thomas, now 6, gaps still in his teeth, though the adult tooth was making preliminary beside Peter Martinez's, and conducted himself beside with a seriousness that lasted approximately 45 minutes before he drew a horse on his. Arithmetic paper instead of completing the problem. She took the paper, showed him she'd seen it, and returned it with a look that communicated expectations without requiring words, which was a skill she'd developed over years and which worked on Thomas about 70% of the time. This was not the 70%. He drew another horse, smaller, in the corner. She let it go. Some battles are about the wrong things. At noon, she stood in the doorway of the building she had designed and watched 19 children eat lunch in the yard outside it, with the chaotic specificity of children who have been contained all morning and are making up for it noise and movement, and the occasional minor conflict over territory. And she felt something that was too straightforward to need ornamentation. With satisfaction. The plain, durable kind that doesn't require an audience. Garrick was at the fence line of the north property when she looked up, watching the same scene. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she had come to understand was what he did when he was feeling something he hadn't organized into words yet. She didn't call out to him. She just looked. He looked back. That was enough for that moment. That was its own kind of conversation. It was 3 weeks later, on an evening in late September, when the first real cold of autumn was making itself known, and the sky above the ranch had gone the specific deep blue that comes just before dark in the high country that he finally said the thing Ida had predicted he was building toward. He came to find her at the schoolroom, which was where he always found her in the evenings now, and she was not surprised by the visit, but she realized, nervous, which she hadn't expected. She was not typically nervous. She had stood in a blizzard and ridden a mining ridge and faced down a town council that hadn't wanted to hear what she was saying, and she was rarely nervous. But she was nervous now, which told her something about what she was expecting him to say and how much it mattered. He sat down in the adult chair she'd finally gotten, a real one, not a student chair across the table from her. He put his hat on the table. He looked at it. "I'm going to say this badly," he said. "Say it anyway," she said. He looked up at her. "I built this ranch because I needed something to do after." He stopped. "After I lost Margaret. And the baby. I needed work that was big enough to keep my mind from going somewhere I couldn't come back from." That was honest. That was what it was. He paused. "But somewhere in the last 11 years, it became something else. Something I cared about in its own right, not just as a place to put my grief." She waited. "And then you arrived," he said. He stopped again. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which she found unexpectedly endearing in a man she had watched cut open his own embankment in a flood without apparent hesitation. The large things did not seem to rattle him. This small, true thing was different. "I told myself it was practical," he said. "The school, the arrangement. I told myself it was about building something useful." "It was about that," she said. "Yes," he said. "And it was also about," looked at her. He said. "It was also about you, Lenora. From the beginning, if I'm honest." From the street in January, she was quiet. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to say that clearly. I spent 15 years being alone, and I got accustomed to it in ways I didn't fully notice until they were there. Most of its windows were dark. I am stubborn about things that don't matter, and sometimes I make decisions without explaining them, and Floyd will tell you I have a temper when I'm short on sleep." "I know," she said. "I've been here 9 months," he stopped. "I know who you are," she said. "That's not a concern." He looked at her. Something in him visibly steadied, like a thing that had been braced for impact and found instead that the ground was solid. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not the way you think I want you to answer it." "I don't generally answer things the way people want me to," she said. "No," he said, "I know that." And he almost smiled. Part of it. She looked at him, at this man who had handed her a cabin and a fair wage and 3 south windows and a cooperative structure that had saved his own ranch, who had not once treated her like a problem he'd taken on, but consistently like a person he was choosing to build something with, who had listened when she talked about Daniel's maps and had used them. Most of its windows were dark, who had sat in a student's chair for 9 months to talk to her in the evenings without making anything of the doing, who had said she was right to Floyd and meant it, and she'd found out about it only because Ida was not a woman who believed in leaving important information uncirculated. "Ask me," she said. "Build the rest of this with me," he said. "Not the ranch, not the school." He paused. "The rest." The lamp between them, the sounds of Iron Hollow settling into night, horses in the barn, the distant low of cattle. Thomas's voice, faint, from the direction of the cabin, arguing something with Eli that she would need to address, but not immediately. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again clearly, without qualification. He breathed out. A slow, long exhale of someone who had been holding something for a while and was now permitted to put it down. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do before in 9 months of daily proximity. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically. Just placed his hand over hers in the plain, unperformed way of someone who has decided on a thing and is doing it. His hand was rough from 30 years of ranch work, and warm from the evening, and she did not move hers away. They sat like that for a while. In the schoolroom, she'd built out of a supply building. In the ranch, he'd built out of grief and purpose. And the night came down over Iron Hollow with the unhurried certainty of a thing that was going to happen regardless. And it was, in its way, perfect, not the perfect of stories that sand the rough edges off, but the real kind, the kind that includes the rough edges and is perfect anyway, because the rough edges are true. They were married in November, on a Saturday, when the first snow of the season was still thin enough to be hopeful rather than threatening, which Ida said was as good an omen as Wyoming offered, and Floyd said was just weather, and both of them were correct. The ceremony happened in the yard of Iron Hollow, which was the only place large enough for everyone who came, and everyone came the ranch families, the families from the eastern settlements, 3 families from south of the ridge, whose children were now in the schoolhouse, Mrs. Elborough in her best coat with her posture immaculate, Nolan Vance standing quietly at the back with his hat in his hands, not celebrating exactly, but present, which was what he'd been able to manage, and which was for now sufficient. The Brennan and Martinez children had made something decorative out of dried grasses and leftover lumber that they presented with enormous pride and which nobody could definitively identify, but which everyone agreed was very nice. Thomas cried during the ceremony. Not from sadness, he explained afterward, with some irritation at himself, that he wasn't sad, he just cried sometimes when things were very good, which was a thing Lenora knew he'd inherited directly from Daniel, and which made her throat tighten in a way she didn't try to stop. Eli stood with his arms crossed and his serious face on and watched everything with the focused attention he'd developed over the past year, and then, after, found Peter Martinez and spent the rest of the afternoon doing whatever it was they did together, which was the highest form of approval 8-year-old Eli was capable of expressing. Samuel shook Garrick's hand before the ceremony. He'd asked to speak to him the week before, privately, and Garrick had gone, and Lenora had not asked what was said because it was between them. What she had seen, when Samuel came back from that conversation, was that something in his face had shifted in a way that was not quite resolution, but was moving toward the particular look of a person who has asked a hard question and received an honest answer and is deciding what to do with both. He shook Garrick's hand before the ceremony with the seriousness of a young man conducting something real, and Garrick took it with the same seriousness, without making it smaller or larger than it was. 3 months after the wedding, Garrick adopted Samuel, Eli, and Thomas legally. It was done in the county courthouse in a proceeding that took less than an hour and involved paperwork, and a judge who seemed mildly bored, which was not the ceremony the moment deserved, but was the ceremony available. Lenora sat beside Garrick with the 3 boys arranged on the bench to her, left Thomas between her and Eli. Samuel's at the far end, and she watched the judge sign the papers, and she kept her breathing even and her face composed, and then immediately stopped, keeping her face composed, when Thomas tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Does this mean he's our dad now?" And she said, "Yes, if you want him to be." Thomas considered this for approximately 2 seconds. "Okay," he said, and turned back to watch the judge. She looked at Garrick. He was looking at the window. His jaw was working in the way it did when he was holding something in, and she knew, from 11 months of daily evidence, that what he was holding in was not grief or regret, but the specific difficulty some people have with feeling things openly in institutional settings, which was a limitation she had no interest in curing because it was real and it was his, and she had not married him for his ease with courtrooms. Put her hand over his. He turned it over and held it. That was the whole of it. The years that followed were not gentle in the way that stories sometimes make years sound. Wyoming was not a gentle place, and ranching was not a gentle occupation. And raising 3 boys, 4 eventually, when Garrick and Lenora's daughter arrived in the autumn of the 3rd year, a red-faced and entirely decided individual whom they named Margaret for the woman Garrick had loved and lost and would not forget, and whom everyone immediately called Maggie because she was clearly a. Maggie was not a gentle undertaking. There were bad seasons. A drought in the 2nd year that hit the North Pasture hard and required the kind of careful accounting that used to keep Lenora up at night. Though she'd gotten better at accounting, meant the weight of the drought was distributed rather than concentrated. There was a winter in the 5th year when 3 of the schoolhouse children got a serious fever, and she spent 2 weeks running between the schoolroom and the sick families and not sleeping more than 4 hours at a time and snapping at Garrick on. Day 9, with a sharpness that she apologized for the following morning, to which he said she was running on 4 hours of sleep, and the apology was unnecessary, and she said it was necessary regardless. Most of its windows were dark, and they disagreed about this briefly and then let it go, because some arguments exist to establish that both people are present and paying attention and don't need to go any further than that. Samuel grew up. This sounds simple, And it was in the way that the most significant things sometimes are simply and gradually and without announcement. He grew up working the ranch beside Floyd, who trained him with the rigorous patience of a man who has decided to teach someone everything he knows. He grew up watching his mother run a school and manage cooperative accounts and make decisions that affected 40 families, and he absorbed what he watched the way soil absorbs water slowly, completely, in a way that changes the composition. He was 17 when Floyd's arthritis became serious enough to limit his work, and he stepped into the gap, not because anyone asked him to, but because he looked at the situation and understood what it needed. Floyd watched him do it with an expression that he maintained was merely professional assessment and which Eyes described, privately, as pride. At 18, Samuel was managing the East sections independently. At 19, he was effectively co-foreman. Not because Garrick had handed it to him. Garrick was careful about that. Careful not to give his son things that needed to be earned. Because he understood that given things do not build the same person as earned things. Samuel had earned it demonstrably in front of everyone who might have had an opinion about it. Nobody had an opinion that needed addressing. Eli became improbably an engineer. The interest had been there since the flood, since the days with Peter Martinez cataloging salvage, since the afternoons watching the Southfield irrigation channels being rebuilt. It had been there in the way he looked at structures and equipment, in the questions he asked that were never about what things were, but about how they worked and why they were built that way rather than another way. Lenora had noticed it the way she noticed things in her students, the pattern, underneath the surface behavior, and she had gotten him the books, and then found him a correspondence course, and then written to an engineering school in the East. When he was 15 and received a reply that required her to sit down. He had left for school at 16, which was earlier than she had wanted, and later than he had wanted, which meant they had agreed on the right time. He wrote once a month. The letters were factual and specific, and carried his personality in every sentence. He came home for harvest season, and for his sister's birthday, and for Christmas most years, and each time he came home, he looked more like himself rather than less, which was all she had ever actually wanted from an education for any of her children. Thomas, her youngest, her horse-daughter, her gap-toothed baby who had asked 14 times on a stage if they were almost there, Thomas became a teacher. Not immediately. He went through a phase at 12 of wanting to be a cattle rancher, and at 14 of wanting to go west toward California, and at 15 of wanting to do something involving explosives that nobody encouraged. But at 16 he sat in on a class that Clara Yates, who had come back to the Valley after 2 years at a teacher's college in Cheyenne, specifically because Lenora had written her and told her the schoolhouse needed her, was giving on. Advanced reading, and something in Thomas's face changed. He asked Clara afterward if he could help with the younger students. Clara said yes. He spent the next 2 years as her assistant and then took over the primary classroom. When Clara moved into secondary instruction, and he was good at it in the way that people are good at, things they were probably always going to be good at, but needed to find the right door into. He was patient with the young ones. He remembered what it was to be small and frightened in a new place and have a teacher look at you, like you were someone who could learn, and he replicated that look deliberately, every day, because he understood its value from the receiving end. Lenora watched him teach once, from the doorway, without his knowing she was there. She watched him coax an answer out of a shy 7-year-old boy who had been staring at the floor, and she watched the boy's face change when he got the answer right, and Thomas said, without performance, "Good, now do the next one," because he understood instinctively that the most useful response to a child who has just succeeded is to believe they can succeed again immediately. She stood in that doorway for a long time. She was thinking about a supply building with a broken window and 9 children and a board across 2 sawhorses. She was thinking about how far that was from here. She was thinking about Daniel, who had believed that people would rise to things when the things were real enough, and how he had been wrong about Nolan, but not wrong about the principle, because here were his sons risen, all 3 of them, each in his own particular way, into people she could not have designed if she'd tried, and which were better for that. Maggie at 7 was already a problem in the best possible sense. She had Garrick's stubbornness and Lenora's intelligence. and some third quality that appeared to be entirely her own, a directness that went past even Lenora's, and which Clara Yates said was going to be either a gift or a catastrophe depending on what direction it found. She sat in the schoolhouse with the utter confidence of a child who has grown up in a place where she has always belonged, which was a quality so different from the quality Lenora's sons had carried in their first months at Iron Hollow, that it sometimes stopped Lenora short when she noticed it. What it felt like to belong somewhere from the beginning. What that made in a person. She had given that to Maggie without even meaning to, just by being here, just by staying. Nolan Vance had rebuilt his relationship with his nephews slowly, across years, in the way that genuine rebuilding works not through a single moment of redemption, but through the accumulation of smaller ones, through the consistent choosing of different behavior. He had come to Samuel's first serious solo cattle drive to watch without being asked to. He had sent Eli a technical book on river engineering when he studied hydrology that was precisely the right book, which meant he'd paid enough attention to know what Eli was studying and what he needed. He came to Thomas's classroom opening and stood in the back and clapped when the first students walked in. He and Lenora were not close. There was too much ground between January 1887 and whatever year they were standing in for closeness to be the honest word. But they were functional. They had found a way to be in the same valley and the same family without either pretense or continued punishment, which is a more complex achievement than it sounds, and which required ongoing maintenance from both sides. She respected the effort he made. She thought, sometimes, that he was someone who had been shown, at great cost to her, what kind of man he didn't want to be, and had spent the subsequent years trying to become a different kind. That was not nothing. It was also not everything. It lived somewhere in between, which was where most real things lived. Iron Hollow became, over the following decade, exactly what Garrick had said he wanted it to be, though the shape it took was not the one he'd imagined alone. Schoolhouse expanded twice. By the 10th year after its founding, it served 63 students from 8 different settlements, with 4 teachers, and a collection of donated and purchased books that would have been unimaginable in the supply building on the east side of the property, where Lenora had started with 9 children and a board across 2 sawhorses. It was known in the valley and beyond it, not as the Iron Hollow School, but as Vance Valley School, a name that had emerged organically from the settlements that used it, and which Lenora had neither sought nor discouraged, because the name was less important than what the name pointed to. Cooperative structure spread, not as if its windows were dark, not as a model that anyone formally promoted, but in the way that things that work tend to spread, because people who have seen a thing work will describe it to people they know, and some of those people will try it. 2 other ranches in the valley had moved to versions of the share structure within 7 years. A third was considering it. There were arguments about implementation each time, and the arguments were necessary because a structure that doesn't get argued about hasn't been looked at hard enough to be trusted. The ranch itself, the cattle, the pasture, the rebuilt south field that was now as productive as it had ever been, was not the richest operation in the territory. That was not what Iron Hollow had been built to be. What it had been built to be was sound, and it was sound. The families who worked it had security that came from genuine ownership, and the security changed what they built. Martinez's son was taking on section responsibility. The Brennan children were grown, and 3 of them had stayed, which Floyd said was the highest possible endorsement of any ranching operation, and which Lenora thought was probably right. She was 41 when she stood at the north fence line of the property. On a September morning the same month they'd opened the schoolhouse the first time, the air with the same quality of just-earned cold, and looked at the valley below. The schoolhouse was visible from here, the expanded version, its windows catching the morning light. The south field was green and grazed. The ranch buildings were solid and maintained and full of the sounds of people going about their actual lives. Garrick came and stood beside her. He was 58 and had gone gray in the temples and the jaw, and still moved with the deliberate care that the flood injury had given him, though it had long since stopped being a limitation and become simply the way he walked. He looked at the same view she was looking at. "You're thinking something," he said. "I usually am," she said. He waited. "I was thinking about what I had when I came here," she said. $19 and 3 boys and a dead man's letter and a closed door. He looked at the valley. And I was thinking that I didn't know what this would be, she said. I didn't come here with a plan for this. I came here with survival, and that was the whole plan. Yes, he said. And now she stopped. Not because she didn't have words, but because the words were large and the morning was quiet and she was a woman who had learned to choose her moments. Now it's this, she said. Whatever this is. What is it? He said. He asked it genuinely, which was how he asked most things. She thought about it honestly. A community, she said. That's what it is. It's not a ranch. It's not a school. It's what happens when people decide to build something together and then keep deciding it. Over and over, even when it's hard. He was quiet for a moment. That's what you built, he said. We built, she said. All of us. You started it, he said. Every part of it that matters, you started. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things for effect. He had never, in all the years she'd known him, said something he didn't mean, which was a quality so unusual in her experience that she had spent the first year expecting it to fail and had eventually accepted it as simply true. I started it because you gave me a level place to stand, she said. That's what you did. You didn't rescue me. You just made the ground even. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, That's all I ever wanted to do. She turned back to the valley, the schoolhouse windows, the green field, the buildings with smoke beginning to come from their chimneys in the cool morning. The sounds of a place that was alive not peacefully, not perfectly, but genuinely alive in the way that only happens when real people are doing real things and have real stakes in how those things go. She thought about the woman she had been on the stage from Cheyenne, cold, frightened, holding her boys together, with the sheer force of refusing to let them see how frightened she was. She thought about standing on Nolan's porch and hearing that door close. She thought about crossing a frozen street toward a stranger's wagon because the alternatives had run out. She had not been saved that evening. She had been given a chance. The difference between those two things was the difference between the life she might have had and the life she had built, and she understood that distinction in the part of herself that was not interested in sentiment, but was interested in truth. You do not need someone to save you. You need someone to make the ground level. And then you need to decide, every single day afterward, what you are going to build on it. She had decided. She had kept deciding. And this, the valley in September, the schoolhouse, the family, the work, the sound of people going about their actual lives. This was what the deciding had made. Maggie came running across the yard below them, her coat open despite the cold, calling something at Thomas that Thomas was ignoring with great dignity. Garrick watched his daughter run, and his face did the thing it did with Maggie, the thing that was so straightforward it barely needed description. He loved her with the particular force of a man who had lost a child before knowing them and had been given this one to know completely, and it showed in every unguarded moment. Her coat's open, Lenora said. I see that. She's going to tell me she wasn't cold. She wasn't cold, he said. She never is. She runs like she's generating her own heat. She is, Lenora said. She absolutely is. He looked at her sideways and she looked back, and between them passed the particular communication of two people who have been looking at each other honestly for years and have gotten very good at what they see, all the difficulty and imperfection and accumulated history of it, all the things they'd gotten wrong and right and wrong again. Most of its window, all the mornings and the arguments and the evenings in the lamplight and the flood and the years and the children who were not all of them theirs by blood, but were all of them theirs completely. Come on, he said. Ida's going to start breakfast without us. Ida starts breakfast. When Ida starts breakfast, Lenora said. She doesn't wait for anyone. She waits for you, he said. Lenora considered this. It was probably true. She does, she agreed. They walked down from the fence line together toward the sound of their family waking up, and the morning opened around them, cool and honest and entirely sufficient, and Iron Hollow began another ordinary day. There is a thing that people say about survival, that it means making it through, getting to the other side, outlasting whatever is trying to take you down. And that is true as far as it goes. Lenora had survived. She had made it through a blizzard and a closed door and a stranger's town and a flood and a campaign of small cruelties designed to make her feel that she did not belong. But survival was not what she was living. Survival was where it had started. What she was living was something she had built with her own hands, out of $19 and stubbornness, and the willingness to cross a street toward uncertainty, when uncertainty was better than the alternative. Out of 3 south windows and a cooperative ledger and a boy's first long division problem and a mining ridge in a flood. Out of one man's decision to make the ground level and one woman's decision to build something on it worth waking up to. And she had, and it had. And every morning when the valley came back into light, and the schoolhouse windows caught the first of it, and the sounds of the ranch rose around her like evidence of all the deciding that had been done and was still being done, every morning was the answer to the question she had asked herself on that stage from Cheyenne, holding her boys in the cold, wondering what there was going to look like. It looked like this. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly everything she had built it to be.